Chapter 976. On a mountain peak that pierced through the clouds, a throne made of white bones and dark green rocks appeared. It was suspended in the air, and in the center was a huge black stone pillar. The height of the mountain peak was close to 3,000 meters, and the height of the throne of fear was more than a few hundred meters. The whole throne was almost close to the clouds, and one could overlook the whole kingdom of fear from it. There was no path to the throne of fear. Unless one had the ability to fly, one would never be able to enter the throne of fear. The Dread Lord had already expected this. His remaining divine power turned into barriers and sealed off the sky around the throne of fear, not allowing anyone to come close. There were 3 lines of defense under the throne of fear. The first line was the advanced devils on the periphery. These devils were all enslaved by the Dread Lord and did not have the freedom of their own souls. They would protect the throne of fear with their lives because if the throne of fear was breached, these devils would all die. The second line of defense was formed by the most devout petitioners. Most of them were top-level dark guards and Dread Lords. They were fanatics when they were alive, and would not take a step back in the face of any enemy. The last line of defense was the slaughterers created by the Dread Lord's divine power. They were very terrifying creatures, and any one of them could challenge an army. There were more than 10 of them under the throne of fear. They prevented anyone from getting close to the throne, including the other petitioners in the kingdom of fear. The sudden increase in the number of enemies brought great pressure to Soren's heroic spirit army. The ugly monkey's attack was stopped, and under the enemy's desperate resistance, he slowly retreated to his original position. At this moment, there were already 50 to 60,000 dark army gathered under the throne of fear. Almost all the enemies in the kingdom of fear who had the ability to teleport had arrived. There were still hundreds of thousands of petitioners enslaved by the Dread Lords while in the kingdom of fear. They were getting ready to surround and destroy Soren's heroic spirit army. If they could not destroy the throne of fear before the petitioners gathered, all the heroic spirits under Soren's command would die here. Fortunately, the Dread Lord had gathered most of his forces under the throne of fear. The Devil Army and the Golem Army were able to advance quickly. They were only 50 to 60 kilometers away from Soren's heroic spirit army. If all the troops were gathered together, the combat power of both sides would be evenly matched, and it would be difficult to determine the victor. However, why would Soren do something that he was only half confident in? As a god that had risen from the ranks of mortals, Soren had always planned his every move. How could he not prepare some final moves at this crucial moment when he was attacking the throne of terror? Get into formation. Following the roars of the heroic spirits, thousands of petitioners lined up into 3 military formations. The demon hunters also flew into the air, while the saint priests began to prepare a large-scale buff spell. Divine spells of this level could not be completed by her alone. The person behind all of this was Soren himself. His divine power was continuously channeling into the bodies of the saint priests. Teams of black-armored dark guards appeared. The Dread Lord had enslaved a large number of demons. Most of them were middle-grade and high-grade demons. As it was close to the border between the Bator Inferno and the Bottomless Abyss, he had also enslaved many demons from the crack. The Dark Guards were still the main force of the Divine Kingdom. These terrifying creatures were similar to demons, but they maintained a human form and looked similar to the demon hunters. The Dark Guards were a very difficult creature to deal with, especially the Dark Guards created by the Dread Lord. They could also evolve into the more powerful Dread Lord. Dread Lord. Challenge rating, 21. This was a kind of semi-holy creature. In the Divine Kingdom, their level of existence was the same as that of a Saint Cardinal. Not only did they have amazing melee ability, but they could also use divine spells below the 7th grade. The most frightening thing about them was that they had an area of effect aura of fear. Since the fall of the god of tyranny, Ban, fear, replaced strife as the core of the Dread Lord. At that time, the power of the aura of fear was given to the powerful petitioners. The aura of the Dread Lord was up to an astonishing diameter of 100 meters. In other words, the biggest difficulty of the current battle was that more than 10 Dread Lords would spread out and cover an area of 1,500 meters with the power of the aura of fear. This kind of spiritual energy would intimidate enemies with weak willpower. Even heroic spirits might be greatly affected. Glory of courage. The saint priests cast a divine spell that made them immune to fear, but the aura was far more powerful than the effect of the spell. The divine spell could only temporarily improve the will of the Dread Lord, not to mention that there was still the residual power of the Dread Lord here. So when the Dread Lords gathered, the combat power of the heroic spirit army was seriously weakened. The ugly monkey was not in a hurry to attack. He was waiting for the arrival of the golem army. The golem puppets were constructs and were basically immune to the effect of the aura of fear. They were mechanical creatures that could only carry out orders, so in the next battle, the golem army must be the ones to fight. Moreover, Soren's big move also needed a little time to prepare. At the same time, far away in the material plane, Gloria's figure appeared at the top of the arcane tower. At this moment, the arcane tower had floated under the control of the fallen witch, but because of the cover of magic, ordinary people could not see the existence of the arcane tower. Gloria stood in the center of the astrology platform. Under her feet was a huge astrology array. With the wind blowing her beautiful long hair, an invisible barrier wrapped the entire arcane tower. A white light appeared under Gloria's feet, which was the characteristic of the top divination spells. At this moment, she was holding a staff in one hand and a crystal ball in the other. She looked like a witch who was divining fate. However, at this moment, Gloria was not divining fate. She was calculating the trajectory of the astral plane, and at the same time, transmitting her magic power and will to the astral plane through the array. A low incantation could be heard. This spell was so long that it was impossible to have time to cast it in most battles because the enemy would not give you such a long time to cast it. However, this was the safe city of Mordor. With the help of the fallen witch, who was guarding by the side, Gloria kept chanting the ancient spell. A total of more than 30 spells took her nearly half an hour. Prophecy, domain. When the last part of the spell was completed, Gloria raised the staff in her hand and pointed to the void. Then a huge amount of magic power surged out. In the blink of an eye, her face became pale, and her whole body seemed to be on the verge of collapse. At this moment, in the distant astral plane, a meteorite that was moving according to its original trajectory suddenly changed direction. It flew directly through the void and flew to the lower plane. Chapter 977. There was still a stalemate on the battlefield. However, with the arrival of the golem army, the pressure on the Dark Guardians increased significantly. They gave up the initiative to attack and turned to defend the throne of fear. Ugly Monkey had not given the order to attack. The golem puppets formed a line of defense in front of the Einherjar army. They seemed to be waiting for the arrival of the demon army or something else. From time to time, Ugly Monkey would look up at the sky and then silently calculate the time, as if he was thinking about the opportunity to attack. Time ticked by. The figure of the Baler appeared in the distance, but it was not on the route of the Einherjar army, but on the other side of the throne of fear. Demons were not easy to control, and it was almost impossible for them to fight together. If they attacked in the same direction, it might lead to internal strife. Sauron, the Baler Lord, attacked the flank. At this time, most of the low-grade demons had died. Almost all the surviving demons were promoted to middle-grade demons. Some of the high-grade demons also plundered the power of divinity from the Lord of Fear. It's almost time. Ugly Monkey seemed to sense something and looked up at the sky. All of a sudden, the weather on the whole battlefield changed drastically, and then a powerful wave of divine power appeared. A crack suddenly appeared in the sky above the Kingdom of Fear. Soren's divine power covered the whole battlefield. He broke the space of the Kingdom of Fear and then guided a terrible spell into this world. It was a huge meteorite about 1 kilometer in diameter. After entering the Kingdom of Fear, it immediately turned into a huge fireball. This terrible meteorite immediately fell at high speed after entering the Kingdom of Fear. Its target was the enemy under the Throne of Fear. Meteorite. It was the most effective spell to destroy a city among the legendary spells. It was also the signature spell of the Northern Witch Council. It was a legendary spell involving prophecy, astrology, spells, and so on. Under normal circumstances, only the leader of the Northern Witch Council could master it. The power of this spell was far beyond that of a meteor burst. The two were not even on the same level. Soren had seen the power of meteor with his own eyes. The Eye of the North had destroyed the steel fortress of the Githyankis with a single meteor. Currently, there were only two people in the north who could master this spell. One was the Eye of the North, and the other was Gloria, who had been trained as the successor of the Northern Witches. It was just that Gloria came to Motor City because of Soren, and more importantly, Soren gave her the scepter of Savras. With the power of prophecy, Gloria could lock onto meteorites in the astral plane and use spells to control them. Rumble. A terrifying impact erupted in an instant. When the meteor crashed, the ground shook, and the nearby mountains crumbled. The only thing that remained unchanged was the main peak that supported the Terror Throne. Huge waves of air mixed with dust flew up to a height of hundreds of meters, expanding like a mushroom cloud. By the time the priests cast their spells to dispel the side effects of the meteor spell, a huge crater with a diameter of about 1,500 meters had appeared in front of them. Cracks had appeared on the ground around it. Thousands of demons and petitioners had died under the meteor spell. If this terrifying spell was used on Mordor City, it would be enough to completely turn Mordor City into ruins. On the other side, all the demons under Sauron's command opened their mouths in surprise. There was a sense of relief on their faces. Although meteor burst took a long time to prepare, it was very fast. The meteor fell in an instant, and the next moment, more than half of the enemies in front of them were cleared. Attack! The high-grade demons who had just plundered a lot of souls were excited. As the crack in the sky gradually disappeared, they obviously realized that the evil gods had joined the battle. This meteor burst greatly weakened the enemy's power. The high-grade demons who had just plundered divinity from the Lord of Fear were eager to move. They seemed to want to get more souls and more power. The Einherjar under the command of the ugly monkey also began to launch a surprise attack. Meteor burst did not cause any casualties to them. Only a small number of golems had a little malfunction because of the terrible impact of the meteor. Now they were paralyzed in place and could not move. The ones with the most casualties were the Dark Army guarding the Throne of Fear. At this moment, their front line had completely collapsed. All the defensive lines became a joke under the meteor spell. Apart from the enemies who could escape by using teleportation spells, almost all the enemies within the range of the meteor spell were killed. The path leading to the Throne of Terror was immediately cleared out, creating a vacuum. Sword of Destruction. Wail of the Banshee. The first to attack was not the ugly monkey, but the little figure who had been hiding in the team. Two figures like little angels were the first to break through the line of defense of the Dark Army and reached the bottom of the Throne of Fear. With the fragments of space torn, a dark magic sword appeared in her hand. Then, there was a large-scale wail of the Banshee. The legendary deadly spell that ignored levels suddenly shrouded many dark guards. The terrible infrasound invaded their brains, and then the enemies fell one after another. Vivian and Lillian. As a true god, Soren could not enter the kingdom of God, but Vivian and Lillian, who had not been officially apotheosized, could. This was their fated battle. Even Soren could not stop the little girl's will. They joined the battle with the Einherjar and were ready to face their own destiny. They were also their most terrible enemies. The Lord of Fear. There were only a few surviving sons of Fear in the material plane. Vivian had almost gathered more than 90% of the divine power of Fear. Two independent consciousnesses each controlled a body. The main body and the simulacrum played an unimaginable cooperation. Under the storm-like spell bombardment, hundreds of demons fell in the blink of an eye. However, just as the two little girls were going on a killing spree, some terrifying figures appeared. They looked like distorted aliens. They locked onto Vivian's position with their scarlet pupils, and then quickly approached them. Slayers found. Activate Diamond Golem Battle Command. Diamond Golems attack. Dull footsteps were heard. At the back of the golem army, the powerful construct life that had not been used was finally activated. These diamond golems with a challenge level above legendary advanced quickly. No demons or petitioners could stop their footsteps. The diamond golems that were modified by Alice had a challenge level of up to 22. Even the Balers were not enough to fight against them in a head-on battle. The all-out attack began. Ugly Monkey sent out all the troops, while he led the demon hunter army and rushed to Vivian's side, protecting the little princess of Motor City as she gradually approached the throne of fear. Soren's power alone was not enough to completely destroy the throne of fear. Vivian had to do it together. Chapter 978. A single meteor spell caused a terrifying number of casualties to the Dark Guards. But under the power of the Dread Lord, they still guarded the throne without fear of death. It wasn't that they were not afraid of death, but that the Dread Lord had completely controlled their souls. These Dark Guards still stubbornly guarded the throne even when they knew death was coming, causing heavy casualties to Soren's Einherjar army. The battle was in a stalemate. But the Einherjar army was still pushing forward little by little, and the golems had suffered heavy losses. Soren had invested tens of thousands of golem puppets in one breath, but now nearly 60% of them had been damaged. If converted into wealth, it would be more than 30 million gold dirhams. The most valuable among them was the soul crystal. As long as any soul crystal was placed inside the golem puppet, if the golem puppet was destroyed again, the extremely valuable soul crystal would be completely destroyed. Half of Soren's losses were in the soul crystals, especially after the 3 diamond golems were destroyed by the terrible Slaughterer, which caused Soren to lose more than 3 million kindler pieces. The 3 legendary quality soul crystals shattered, and all that was left was the broken shell of the diamond golem. The Einherjar army's casualties were close to 30%. If it was an army from the material plane, it would have collapsed long ago. But these were all Soren's petitioners. Their existence was to deal with the crueler war in the kingdom of God, so even now, none of the petitioners took a step back. They kept charging toward the Dread Lord in front of them, ready to break through the enemy's defense line and open a path for Vivian to reach the throne of fear. A stalemate was not what Soren wanted to see. At this time, in the distant city of Motor, the high priest in charge of monitoring the battlefield had a serious expression. He said in a deep voice, "The petitioners of the Dread Lord are coming. They have formed a large encirclement. We don't have much time left." There weren't only so many petitioners in the Kingdom of Fear. There were about millions of petitioners in the entire Kingdom of Fear. Although these petitioners weren't as powerful as the Dark Guards and couldn't rush to the battlefield immediately, they were approaching rapidly. If they were surrounded by them, they would eventually fall into a terrifying siege of numbers. Thaling number 1's cold voice rang out, "I suggest activating the golem's self-destruct mechanism. Blast a way out of the enemy's defensive line." Golem self-destruct device. This was an ability that came from the mechanical nirvana of the clock. When the self-destruct mechanism was activated, the golem would explode, and the power of the explosion was equivalent to the fireball cast by a legendary wizard. The high priest fell silent for a moment. Then, she said solemnly, "Activate the golem's self-destruct mechanism. We have to open a passage within 5 minutes." Following her order, a group of special golem puppets on the battlefield began to rapidly approach. Their eyes flashed with red light, and after charging into the midst of the Dark Guards, they quickly exploded. Boom! Boom! Over 100 golems exploded one after another, quickly creating a vacuum in the midst of the enemy. Charge! Ugly Monkey seized the opportunity and led the demon hunters to charge forward. At this moment, Vivian and Lillian also caught up. They quickly broke through the defensive line and reached the bottom of the throne of fear. There were a total of 6 slaughterers guarding the bottom. "Your Excellency Vivian. Enter the throne of fear directly. Leave this to us." Ugly Monkey led 2 Otherworld God servants to block the slaughterers from the left and right. The Otherworld God servants were equivalent to angels, and were only slightly weaker than the slaughterers. Since there were many demon hunters nearby, it shouldn't be a problem to hold them off for now. Vivian also knew that the situation was critical. The little girl nodded and rushed toward the throne of fear. As if sensing Vivian's arrival, a powerful consciousness gradually awakened. In an instant, the weather changed. Dark clouds covered the sky above the throne of fear. Accompanied by rumbling lightning, a strange green flame ignited along the way. The dark guards guarding the throne of fear became even crazier. They blocked the enemy without fear of death. At the same time, a group of slaughterers rushed toward Vivian. "My good daughter. Come. Come to mommy." A strange voice called out to her. It was a gentle female voice with motherly tenderness. It rang in Vivian's ears. She couldn't help but be stunned. However, she was quickly pushed by Lillian, who anxiously said, "Don't be in a daze. This is the Dread Lord's scheme. He's trying to buy time." Outside of the god of fear, Soren, who had been paying close attention to the battlefield, was also stunned. Because he also heard that familiar voice. The voice seemed to have awakened a distant memory, awakening a beautiful yet haggard face in the deepest part of his memory. Their birth mother. Soren's mother, who was also Vivian's mother. In the kingdom of God. Vivian and Lillian approached the throne of fear quickly. When they arrived at the throne of fear, a beautiful figure clad in a long dress appeared. She seemed rather haggard, but displayed a motherly smile. She stood in the throne of fear, gazed at Vivian, smiled, and spread her arms. "Vivian. My good daughter. You're finally here? Come here. Come to mommy." Vivian froze on the spot. On the other hand, Lillian was astonished. Because everything before them wasn't an illusion. A real soul appeared before them. And that soul was their mother. "Come here. My good daughter." Vivian's mother smiled. Her smile was so gentle as though she recalled something. "Don't you miss Xerxes? Xerxes is here too. Hurry up. Come to me." Another radiance shone. A loyal old dog appeared beneath the woman's feet. It wagged its tail obediently at Vivian as though calling her over. Xerxes. Vivian was more agitated to see the old dog than when she saw her mother. She extended her arm as though wanting to touch it. But eventually, she retracted her arms slowly. The young lady glared at the empty throne of fear and yelled, "It's you. You're the one who imprisoned their souls. You damn bastard. Release their souls." A deep, eerie chuckle sounded. A dark shadow shrouded the throne of fear as though countless eyes were watching them. The deep voice said, "Kill me. Your mother will die. Xerxes will die too. Completely die. Their souls have been imprisoned in the throne of fear. Destroying the throne of fear means killing them with your own hands. Do you really want to do that? You want to kill your own mother? And your most loyal Xerxes?" Chapter 979. Heath. Mother. Vivian appeared to be in great pain while Lillian, who stood beside her, looked anxious. Lillian shook her arm and said, "Big sister. We can't delay any longer. Or else, all our efforts will go to waste." This was the first time Lillian addressed Vivian as Big Sister so formally. It was imaginable how anxious she was. But she wasn't the owner of this body, after all. What she controlled was an avatar of the simulacrum spell and didn't have the ability to destroy the Terror Throne. In order to destroy the Terror Throne, Vivian had to be the one to lead it. "Big Brother is waiting for us," Lillian said anxiously. At that moment, the Terror Overlord's furious roar sounded. "Shut up. You damn traitor. I created you. I gave you power. But you betrayed me." Lillian curled her lips in disdain. "Betrayed you? You created me just to revive yourself. I'm the Witch of Terror, Lillian. Not a puppet to be manipulated by anyone." The situation changed. The situation on the battlefield was getting more and more severe. Vivian was only a little girl in her teens, after all. Although she was naturally mature and intelligent, it was undoubtedly a very painful and difficult decision for her to make to destroy the throne of terror, kill her mother, and kill her loyal dog, Heath, with her own hands. Even though Lillian urged anxiously, she still couldn't do it because those two were the most important people in her heart apart from her big brother. Besides, her mother was still calling her name. Damn it. Lillian was like an angry kitten. She growled at Vivian, "How long are you going to hesitate? If this operation fails, Big Brother will be in great danger. Since you can't do it, give me control of this body. Let me do it." Lillian vanished as soon as she finished speaking. She returned to Vivian's body and was about to seize control of the body. However, at this moment, a crack suddenly appeared in the sky, followed by a golden ray of light that fell from the sky. Big Brother. Vivian raised her head. Her beautiful eyes were filled with tears. For such a kind-hearted little girl, it was too cruel for her to personally end her mother and the old dog that had grown up with her. This would make her feel guilty for the rest of her life. Soren didn't enter the divine kingdom of fear, but his voice reached the little girl's ears. "Let me do it." His voice was low. As the voice fell, the golden light turned into a sharp sword and fell directly toward the souls of his mother and Heath. No. Vivian's eyes widened in shock, but she remained where she was. Outside the divine kingdom. Soren also closed his eyes at this moment. Killing her mother and the loyal old dog, Heath, was too heavy for Vivian. If she had to do it herself, she would probably feel uneasy for the rest of her life. If that's the case, then let me bear all the sins. The attack on the divine kingdom of fear must not fail. Even if he didn't kill them, if the Dread Lord won, then everything would be meaningless. In the end, Soren chose to do it himself. Attacking the divine kingdom of fear was a gamble in itself, and for this battle, Soren almost put his own future on the line, so he couldn't back down and give up no matter what. Killing his mother? These might be able to threaten the kind Vivian. But they would never be able to threaten Soren. He was an evil god standing in the bottomless abyss. His path to godhood had long been stained with blood. If the Dread Lord thought that he could threaten him with 2 souls, then the enemy was too naive. Divine shockwave. The golden divine power directly hit the throne of fear. With the vibration of the distance, the 2 souls gradually dissipated under the brilliance of the divine power. Lillian had returned to her body. "Sister." Her anxious voice resounded in his mind as she hurriedly said, "Hurry up and do it. It's almost too late." Vivian slowly raised her head. Her expression at the moment was a little blank, but it was more of a pitiful sadness. A trace of anger appeared in the little girl's eyes, and then it burned like a raging fire. Her small figure floated in the air, looking at the darkness around the throne of fear, and said coldly, "I want to die with my mother and Heath." Her voice became colder and colder, and in the end, it turned into a sharp sound wave. A terrible wind raged on the throne of fear. At this moment, Vivian seemed to have turned black, and there was a terrible killing intent in her eyes that had never been seen before. A huge amount of divine power surged out like a tsunami. The divine power from the other sons of fear was crazily injected into the throne of fear. The terrible power caused a crack to appear on the throne of fear. The crack gradually expanded, and the whole throne of fear also showed signs of collapse. Vivian was fighting for the power of the divine title of fear. Although the Dread Lord had died, his divine title was still sealed in the throne of fear. He just distributed his divine power to the sons of fear. Yes. Destroy this place. That's it. Sister. Let me give you a hand. Small black wings appeared behind Vivian, and Lillian's will also appeared. She cooperated with the little girl to use the divine power of fear to crazily attack the throne, destroying the balance and power in it, and destroying the last hope of the Dread Lord's resurrection. No. Damn it. The black shadow roared crazily, and then the black breath around gathered together and turned into the figure of a man wearing black armor and holding a huge sword. This was the true body of the Dread Lord. It was also the last body that his soul could condense. He rushed towards the two little girls crazily, ready to stop them from destroying the throne of fear. However, at this time, a golden light appeared in the sky again, and a huge golden palm stretched out from the sky. Soren's low voice sounded, "Your enemy is me." Divine form. Outside of the divine realm of fear, Soren's figure turned into a golden giant hundreds of meters high. Because of the avatar crisis, his body could not enter the divine realm of fear, but his power could penetrate the plane barrier. At this moment, he was completely squandering his divine power to fight with the enemy. The golden body was constantly consuming his stored divine power. Boom! There was a loud sound of cracking. In the corner of the throne of fear, the huge skull with burning flames had cracked and separated from the throne of fear. With the whistling of the wind, it fell from a height of thousands of meters. Cracks appeared one after another. The runes engraved on the throne of fear had already cracked. Even the stone pillars supporting the throne had cracks on them. Ah! Vivian's sharp cry sounded. At this moment, the little girl's clothes had turned into flying ashes. Under the structure of divine power, a strange black dress armor appeared. A black sword of destruction appeared in her palm. The little girl roared and held the sword with both hands directly into the center of the throne of fear. Chapter 980. Rumble. The throne of fear that had stood in the God's kingdom for thousands of years finally collapsed. With the destruction of the throne of fear, tens of thousands of souls flew out from the throne of fear. Vivian's battle was over. As the body of fear, only she could easily destroy the throne of fear. However, Soren's battle was not over yet, because Vivian had only destroyed the soul vessel of the Dread Lord, and the essence of the Dread Lord's soul still needed Soren to end it. Slaughter, realm. Crafty, realm. Death, realm. The golden light spread out like waves, and Soren's arm was like the palm of a titan, directly grabbing the shadow after the throne of fear was broken. An enemy with great divine power was very scary. However, if the enemy was already dead and only a soul was left, Soren was not afraid at all. The power of slaughter and death blocked all the escape routes of the Dread Lord. Soren's body could not enter this world, so it was impossible for him to fight hand to hand. The only way he could kill the Dread Lord was to use the most direct and violent divine power shockwave. No! With a desperate roar, the shadow gradually shattered under the impact of Soren's divine power. This was the most direct way to destroy the enemy, using a huge amount of divine power to crush the enemy, but it was also the most exhausting way to fight. Countless souls surged out. As an evil god, the Dread Lord had bound many souls over the years. These souls were not only the believers who went against his will, but also the believers of other hostile gods. These believers were sacrificed to please the Dread Lord, and the Dread Lord imprisoned their souls. This was the most common method used by evil gods. The Queen of Spiders had imprisoned many elven souls. Now with the death of the Dread Lord, these souls were free. However, Soren did not intend to let these souls go. He was not a compassionate god. With the spread of the golden light, Soren's huge palm grabbed these souls and kept them in his palm. These were all high-quality souls. The Dread Lord would use them to complete his throne and bind them to provide him with power. Meanwhile, Soren was preparing to turn them into petitioners. After Vivian took over the Dread Lord's divine title, she would need a new batch of petitioners. The last of his aura dissipated. As the Dread Lord's soul was completely erased by Soren, countless golden rays of light rained down like meteors. This was the power of the Dread Lord's divinity and quintessence. The divinity released by the fall of a powerful god was extremely frightening. Most of the power surged into Vivian's body, including the fear and strife priesthoods. The fear priesthoods entered Vivian's soul, while the strife priesthoods entered Lillian's soul. These were the two souls that were most qualified to inherit the power of the Dread Lord. The third person was Soren, who held the divinity of slaughter and death. The power of death surged into Soren's body. As the successor of the three death gods, Soren obtained about 1/3 of the power. As for the rest of the divinity, it was scattered among the other creatures on the battlefield. Not only the Baelor Lord Sauron, but even the succubus owner's mother, Rhaenys, obtained the power of divinity. Then, she automatically gained the legendary ability of Fear Aura. The demonic power Sauron obtained the most divinity. It was about 8 divinity, and at the same time, a small amount of quintessence was absorbed. Many greater demons obtained 1 to 2 divinity. These scattered divinity added up to about 30 divinity. They were automatically absorbed by the beings that were compatible with them. The ugly monkey and some demon hunters also obtained this power. Among them, more than 10 demon hunters automatically understood the Fear Aura. A powerful god would have at least 300 divinity and quintessence. Because this was the kingdom of fear, the divinity and quintessence were not scattered. The Dread Lord was an old god. Even if he didn't do much in the past 1,000 years, his divinity should be more than 320 divinity. It was more difficult to increase the quintessence, so it could only be calculated as 300 divinity. Vivian and Lillian obtained most of the divine power. Along with the cold prompt, the divinity that Soren obtained also appeared in front of his eyes. You've killed the Dread Lord. Extracting the target's soul energy. You've obtained 32 million slaughter EXP. The target has divinity. Extracting the target's divinity. You've obtained 77 divinity. The target has quintessence. Extracting the target's quintessence. You've obtained 75 quintessence. The power of fear domain has increased. The power of slaughter domain has increased. The power of death domain has increased. The power of domination domain has increased. The power of order domain has increased. The power of evil domain has increased. You've obtained tyranny domain. You've obtained strife domain. The powerful divinity and divine power from the Dread Lord were absorbed by Soren. As expected of an enemy with great divine power, Soren obtained the most divinity in history. And this was only a part of it. The Dread Lord's soul energy was devoured by Soren, which brought him as much as 32 million slaughter EXP. Not only did it make up for the millions of slaughter EXP that Soren used to kill the Dread Lord, but it also gave him more than 20 million slaughter EXP. The divine power alone wasn't enough to defeat the golden giant hand. Soren had almost completely entered the form of a divine spirit in the battle just now, and he was burning hundreds of thousands of slaughter EXP every minute. Most of the power went into Vivian's body. But at this moment, the little girl didn't have much joy on her face. On the contrary, she looked quite sad and murmured, "Heath. Mother. Heath." A strong repulsive force appeared. Vivian's figure automatically rose into the air. The power of the Dread Lord allowed her to directly advance to intermediate divine power, but this also meant that the power of the Avatar crisis was acting on her body, and the kingdom of God was gradually rejecting her. Soren looked at the sad Vivian. The golden giant hands suddenly spread out in front of her, and then 2 white souls appeared in his palm. Vivian immediately covered her mouth in surprise when she saw it, and then her face was full of disbelief and surprise. "Mother. Heath." The little girl seemed to want to rush over, but the power of the kingdom of God had already made her angry, and an irresistible force was sending her out of the kingdom of God. Outside the kingdom of God. Soren sighed softly, and then broke through the air to directly catch Vivian. If he didn't do so, the little girl would fall directly into the material plane. Because she had already become a god. Chapter 981. With the death of the Dread Lord, the battle in the Divine Kingdom soon ended. Some of the Dark Guards died directly, and the rest of the petitioners also fell in large numbers. These were the existences whose souls were bound by the Dread Lord. Because of the complete death of the Dread Lord, they also fell. As for the rest of the petitioners, their reaction was very fast. They immediately turned to Vivian's subordinates. Some of the Dread Lords who did not fall almost immediately surrendered to Vivian. Although the main battle was over, there were still many battles left. Although Vivian inherited the Dread Priesthood, there were still many things in the divine kingdom that she could not control. These needed to be cleaned up by Soren's army. Moreover, the wealth accumulated by the Dread Kingdom for thousands of years was still a huge amount of resources, even if a lot of it was given out. Mordor City suffered heavy losses in this battle. Sauron's demon army was a little better. At most, he could go back to the Abyss and recruit new demons. The Abyss did not have many things, but there were too many demons. However, the number of golem puppets in Mordor City was so large that it almost wiped out Sauron's resources. In this battle, nearly 80% of the clay golems had died, and 70% of the stone golems had been damaged. The iron golems had suffered the greatest loss, because they had used up a lot of energy from their self-destruction. In the end, there were only 30 or so stone golems that could move. Half of the diamond golems were scrapped, and the remaining diamond golems were also seriously damaged. Mordor City had destroyed nearly 10,000 golem puppets in this battle, which almost wiped out the foundation of the golem army that had been accumulated since the Avatar crisis. The direct economic loss was not easy to calculate, but 10 million Kindler was definitely more than that. With such a heavy loss of the golem army, Soren's golem factory almost needed to start manufacturing again. And this required a lot of resources. To make up for the loss of the golem army, he could only plunder resources from the divine kingdom of fear. The loss of the Einherjar army was also not small. 3 of the otherworldly divine servants had died in battle. 50% of the demon hunters had died, and 30% of the petitioners had died. Almost a third of Soren's wealth was gone in an instant. Wars between gods' kingdoms were always so tragic. If it weren't for the fact that the losses were so great, the gods wouldn't have been so restrained. After the Throne of Terror was destroyed, the Baelor Flame Demon Lord Sauron returned with his demon army. On the other hand, Soren's petitioners began to spread out and occupy the divine kingdom of fear, collecting all kinds of resources as much as possible. If Vivian wanted to enter the kingdom of God, she had to wait until the end of the Avatar crisis. Soren couldn't send an army into the kingdom of fear again. Therefore, how many people could be taken away this time would determine how much strength could be restored during the Avatar crisis. Although the casualties were very shocking. However, it was all worth it. Putting aside the power that Soren had gained, just the fact that Vivian and Lillian had advanced to become mid-tier gods was already the greatest success. Now, there were already 2 mid-tier gods in Mordor City. As long as Vivian successfully mastered the power of the Dread Lord, Soren wouldn't have the slightest fear even if the enemy was a greater god. At the same time, in the distant material plane, there were many dark basements, wilderness caves, and dark corners of the city. Many altars and shrines that were responsible for worshipping the Dread Lord had undergone astonishing changes. Accompanied by a golden radiance, the original statue of the Dread Lord suddenly disappeared. Then, 2 twin statues of the Dread Lord appeared, one on the left and one on the right. These were the statues of Vivian and Lillian. One of them took over the priesthood of fear, and the other took over the priesthood of strife. Such a great change meant that the Dread Lord had completely fallen. Although the Church of the Dread Lord in the material plane had been severely damaged, it was undoubtedly going to collapse at this moment. Many priests and believers who originally served the Dread Lord gave up their faith and went to other evil gods, such as the Goddess of Night, the Lord of Storms, the Goddess of Ocean, and so on. As a new god, Vivian didn't inherit much of the original faith of the Dread Lord. The already few believers directly lost nearly 60% of them after she took over the priesthood. However, this didn't matter at all. Because at the same time that Vivian succeeded in becoming a god, her temple had begun to be built in Mordor City, and the church that had been gathered was quickly unified and built a basic outline. Everything of the Dread Lord wasn't suitable for her to inherit. As a new god, the most suitable thing for Vivian was undoubtedly the re-established church. Mordor City. The Grand Harvest celebration was still going on. However, the complete fall of the Dread Lord couldn't be hidden from others at all. The first to know was the Goddess of Agriculture, then Soren's god, the Maiden of Pain, and then other gods in the material plane also got the news, and they all turned their attention to the island of Mordor. No one thought that Soren would use the name of the harvest celebration to confuse others, and then directly attack the kingdom of the Dread Lord, and finally win. This was simply unimaginable. The war of the gods' kingdom was far more intense than the war in the material plane. With the mortal army of Motor City, even if they invested 1,000,000, it was unlikely to win. But now Soren actually destroyed the Dread Throne, which meant that he still had a very powerful hidden power, and this power was something that they had never noticed. Vivian and Lillian fell into a state of half-sleep as soon as they returned to Motor City. This was something that they had to face when they officially became gods, because they had begun to receive the prayers of their believers. However, compared to Soren's painful state when he just became a god, the two girls were obviously much more relaxed. At least they didn't fall into the kind of chaos in their souls that was suddenly hit by a huge amount of prayer information. They could accommodate all prayers and beliefs, and began to learn how to respond to the prayers of their believers and give the priests the corresponding divine spells. This was a very complicated ability. But it was something that every god had to face. Soren could teach them how to respond to prayers and give them divine spells, but the two girls still had to master how to deal with it. They had just become gods and had been learning these things almost all day, especially the ability to give priests divine spells. At present, nearly a third of the priests in the church that served them hadn't received divine spells. After all, the two of them didn't have the data ability of Soren. Without the divine network, each divine spell had to be given by themselves. The Grand Harvest celebration was still going on. However, Motor City seemed to have fallen into silence after the shocking battle. No one would think that Soren, the Lord of Shadows, would stop so easily. Obviously. He was brewing a bigger conspiracy, and was recovering and accumulating strength to find the next target. Chapter 982. The complete death of the Dread Lord seemed to have removed a mountain from Soren's heart. At this moment, he could finally breathe a sigh of relief because history had been completely changed by him. Lillian, the Witch of Fear, did not die in the hands of the Silver Moon Lady, and she also took over the divine title of Strife. As for the Silver Moon Lady, she was caught in the war with the Lady of Night. The two ancient goddesses who had been fighting for countless years were already in a fierce battle. The goddess of agriculture returned to the continent after the harvest celebration. However, before she left, she talked to Soren for a while. Before she left, she looked at Soren deeply. At this time, the city of Motor had become one of the most powerful forces in the material plane. Although Vivian was still learning how to become a true god, receiving faith and giving divine spells, the power of the Dread Lord had gathered on them. As mid-level gods, their combat power was quite amazing. As for Soren himself, he was also in an important stage of accumulation at this moment. The divine power of the Dread Lord still needed to be completely integrated with him. The more than 30 million slaughter EXP still needed to be arranged. Soren's strength needed to be accumulated before he could break through again. A week passed in the blink of an eye. Soren, who returned to the city of Motor, was busy controlling the new power of divinity, and the first thing to improve was his divinity. After successfully killing the Dread Lord, Soren's divinity accumulated to 350 points, and he became a great divinity. After Soren killed the number 1 enemy, he didn't need to deliberately keep the slaughter EXP. Finally, he could use it to level up his profession. At this time, Soren's attributes had become quite amazing. Name, Soren, Holy Form, Mid-Level Divine Power. Race, Half-Elf, Massacre God's Son. Attributes, Strength 24, Agility 44, Constitution 30, Intelligence 31, Wisdom 22, Charm 26. Alignment, Lawful Evil Class, Level 15 Rogue, 03550000, Level 10 Shadow Dancer, Max, Level 10 Wizard, 04225000, Level 16 Arcanist, 04850000, Grade 8. Health Points, 825825, Robust, EXP, 150575 Slaughter EXP, 35,545 Profession EXP, Unassigned. Skill Points, None Attribute Points, None Legend, 350. Divinity, 350, middle divinity. Upgrading, greater divinity, requires 900 points. Godhood, 240, mid-grade godhood, requires 300 points to upgrade, great divinity. Divine power, 15134800. Upgrading to greater divine power requires 1200 divine power points and mastery of deities descending, divine law. The current divinity storage limit is 4800 points. Clergy, shadow, thief, half-elf, rogue, tracker. Domains, tyranny, strife, mage, disease, poison, trickery, slaughter, death, fear, evil, domination, piracy, shadow, flora. Spirit chi, evil spirit chi, fear spirit chi. Status, normal. Basic skills, sneak 655, literacy 535, steal 525, pick lock 475, snare 415, focus 425, negotiate 585, appraise 425, deceive 425, intimidation 675, taunt 355, perform 375, listen 485, dodge 525, parry 385, block 375, heal 375, search 475, detect 605, scroll copy 375, spell identify 415, survival 385, use magic equipment 375, cooking 325, alchemy 515, forge magic weapon 375. Saint form, transcendence, spell immunity 1 to 4, epic divine power, instant spell cast 1 to 3. Godhood immunity, acid, electricity, fire, instant death. Godhood abilities, space change, death's hand, reality change, form change, divine power shockwave, language proficiency, character proficiency, interplane communication, astral teleportation, plane teleportation. Legendary skills, epic magic power, epic spell cast, 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 epic tenacity, epic spell penetration, epic reflex, epic weakness detection, perfect dual wielding, omnipotent hands, epic evasion, epic battle skills, epic dexterity, epic intelligence, epic constitution. Special abilities, blessing of the goddess of magic, god slayer, blessing of the misfortune goddess, blessing of the sea goddess, dragon blood baptism LV2, heart of slaughter, slayer, death walker, ascetic, erudite, blasphemy. Personal abilities, nimble left hand, eidetic memory, perseverance, encyclopedic knowledge, spellcasting proficiency, reflex evasion, intuitive evasion, roll evasion, agile movement, evade sight, dark vision, combat spellcasting, mobile spellcasting, spell control, empower spell, extreme spell casting, craft magical equipment, spell penetration, high magic resistance, high cold resistance, high fire resistance, high poison resistance, high lightning resistance, sturdy, high regeneration. Advanced, telepathy 100 feet. Profession abilities, arcane memory, arcane counterspell, arcane runes, shadow dominator, nimble mind, military weapon, proficiency, curved sword, legendary. Combat skills, summon shadow, any, shadow jump, any, shadow strike, any, shadow jump, any, vampiric touch, divinity, sword form, heavy hack, sword form, horizontal slash, sword form, beheading, sword form, waist chop, sword form, spinning strike, spinning slash. After killing the Dread Lord, Soren's strength had increased tremendously. If one were to use specific data to calculate, it would take more than 3 days and 3 nights to finish. However, the most obvious increase could still be calculated. The most obvious was the increase in his attributes and basic abilities. Soren had completely caught up with the old gods. Then there was an additional ability, divinity immunity. This was the standard for becoming a great god. Soren's divinity immunity was acid, lightning, fire, and instant death. Simply put, acid damage and acid spells were ineffective against Soren. Lightning spells and lightning damage were ineffective against Soren. He was completely immune to normal fire damage, and any instant death would be automatically ignored. Soren was completely immune to all instant death spells. Of course, the power of the divine spark immunity was not completely obtained, because this ability also included immunity to attribute absorption, immunity to attribute damage, disease, cold, disintegration, energy absorption, mental influence, paralysis, poison, sleep, intimidation, transformation, imprisonment, banishment, and so on. Soren was still not a great god. So currently, he was mainly improving to deal with the most common damage effects. Then there were the legendary abilities, which were legendary spell maximization, epic magic, and legendary spell instant cast. These abilities could not be enhanced by the power of the divinity. Even Soren had to rely on his own profession level to obtain these abilities. The most obvious increase was in the divinity of shadow. Soren had now completely merged with the divinity of shadow. He had obtained the ability to summon shadows at will, jump 500 meters at will, attack at will, and travel at will. Simply put, he could use these abilities infinitely. He had come into contact with the origin of the shadow power. These abilities within the scope of the divinity had no limit at all. Unless he lost the divinity of shadow, in that case, he would recover the abilities brought by his original profession level. The closer Soren was to the great divine power, the more he felt the horror of the great divine power. He finally knew why there were not many great divine powers promoted for so long. It was because the 900 divinity value alone was already a difficult task. If there was no outbreak of the Avatar crisis, it would take a normal god many years to accumulate it. Now Soren's divinity value had reached 240 points. That was to say, as long as he killed a strong enough target, then he could officially enter the range of great divine power and be qualified to become the main god of a divine system. The end of the Avatar crisis was getting closer and closer. Around the end of next year, the last wave of impact would break out. There was not much time left for Soren. Because when the Avatar crisis was completely over, it was not easy for Soren to kill a weak divine power god. This often meant that he needed to completely destroy the other party's church and divine kingdom. At that time, the structure of the gods would be stabilized again. In the blink of an eye, it was early September. The silent Mordor city was accumulating strength, and the golem factory was constantly producing new puppets. At this time, some new things began to appear, such as the bank that had recently appeared in Mordor city, and a large number of farms in the Wind Spear Hills. After enduring for a long time, the elemental god finally couldn't help but take action. Near the Eastern Sea, the god of water elements and the god of fire elements broke out in a shocking battle. Fortunately, this battle was far away from human territory and did not cause too many casualties. Therefore, the gods were already very busy and did not want to care about it. The rampaging fire and water elements raged near the battlefield. This mess could not be cleaned up during the Avatar crisis. It could only be slowly dealt with after the Avatar crisis. Note, the sequelae of the elemental turmoil will remain until the end of the Avatar crisis. The god of light had also encountered a little trouble recently. That was, near the holy city, some traces of the undead gradually emerged. What made the holy knights even more uneasy was that they actually found traces of the Winter Ghost. Winter Ghost, challenge level 25. The Winter Ghost was made by the demigod Lich, who sought the ultimate limit of the power of the undead. They usually stayed in the forgotten corrupted fortresses in the astral world or the negative energy world. They were terrible evil creations in a long history, and they were extremely powerful liches. Vampires and demigod Lich could get the help of the Winter Ghost and form a temporary alliance. These terrible creatures had the special ability of Cold Aura. They could use withering fire, and they could launch a destructive blow that was far beyond the power of the gods. They were the ultimate creation of the demigod Lich, and their natural strength value had reached a terrifying 52 points. That's right. These terrible monsters were even higher than the father of the oak tree in terms of strength value. If it weren't for the characteristics of the undead, even the gods would not have much chance of winning against them. But now it was the time of the Avatar crisis, and the gods did not have much advantage against the Winter Ghost in the form of saints. This kind of creature should not appear in the material plane. They should stay in the death plane with the strongest negative energy, but now they actually appeared, and there seemed to be other forces behind them. P.S. The attributes of the winter ghost can be searched on Baidu Encyclopedia. Chapter 983. The fourth wave of the Avatar crisis was coming. Soren could feel the increasingly strong death aura in the material plane because of the war. The appearance of the winter ghosts was just a sign. As the protagonists of the fourth wave of the Avatar crisis, the powerful demigod liches and the undead kings were still hiding in the dark. The gods had ruled the multiverse for countless years, and the pressure of this long time could not be dissipated by a single Avatar crisis. They still feared the gods from the bottom of their hearts, so they did not dare to act rashly. When the death energy in the material plane reached a certain level, or when they believed that the gods had become very weak, it was the time for the demigod lich and the undead lords to stand on the stage. And this process would take a little time. Because there was still a very important catastrophe ritual. They needed to wake up the sleeping undead and bring more death to the material plane. This was a huge ritual to change the characteristics of the plane. It would inject a trace of the power of death into the material plane and temporarily suppress the divine power of the King of the Dead, Kalemver, so that the dead would not be able to rest in peace. In the end, they would be revived as wandering undead. Motor City. Soren stood on the tower and looked down at the whole earth. The impact of the undead disaster had shown a trace, and at this moment, even he was a little uneasy in his heart. Because a big event would happen during this time. A big event that would affect the entire death divine system. That was, the King of the Dead, Klemvox was attacked by the demigod liches and the undead kings. Soren did not know where this battle happened. Because the King of the Dead, Klemvox had not shown up so far. On the eve of the outbreak of the undead, the main god of the death divine system was attacked by many kings from the negative energy plane and was seriously injured. This injury caused the long sleep domain that he mastered to fail and could no longer cover the material plane and the spiritual world, so that most of the dead could not rest in peace and directly turned into undead under the death aura. Klemvox had been working hard to let the dead sleep. The intensity of the outbreak of the undead disaster was directly related to him. The demigod liches would only show up after defeating him. Their goal was the priesthood of death. Moreover, there was another grim reaper behind this plot, and that was the incomparably evil Naruto. There was no way that so many demigod-level liches and undead lords would gather for no reason. Even if the demons were trying to instigate them, they would not act together. There must be a powerful Grim Reaper behind all of this. Although Soren did not have any evidence to confirm his suspicions, he believed that Naruto was the biggest suspect. The Avatar crisis was a special period. During this period, all the capable and ambitious evil gods were ready to make a move. The Spider Queen's web could be activated at any time, and the Lady of Night was also planning an unknown conspiracy. It was not surprising that Naruto wanted Klemvox's priesthood. It was just that his actions were so secretive that even Soren could not get any information. Klemvox, the King of the Dead, had a special existence in the whole death god system because his doctrine was to let the dead sleep. This led him to stand on the opposite side of many powerful creatures who studied death. The most iconic ones were the demigod-level liches and the undead lords. In contrast to Klemvox, Naruto was a neutral evil god. He had no conflict with most of the demigod-level liches, and there were a lot of undead among his believers and priests. He was called the Terminator of Life. For most of the evil undead, this Grim Reaper's actions and doctrines were in line with their ideas. That was to end life. No impact of the Avatar crisis was born for no reason. The first few impacts were due to the greed and plundering of the souls of the material plane by the lower planes, and the later impacts were due to the long-standing hatred and contradictions between the main gods of the elemental planes. The giant web of the Queen of Spiders was due to thousands of years of hatred and ambition, and the conspiracy of the Lady of Night was due to the inseparable contradiction with the Lady of Silvermoon from the beginning. The outbreak of the undead disaster was also related to Klemvox, because the original three death gods were very evil, and he began to work hard to let the undead sleep. This kind of contradiction that had been accumulated for thousands of years was very terrible once it broke out. Soren did not dare to act rashly at the moment. He could only wait quietly for the mastermind behind the scenes to show up. Moreover, the main force of this impact could not be Soren. The god of light must have been investigating everything now. Demons, undead, devils. These three were undoubtedly the most hated existence of the god of light. Ghouls, skeleton soldiers, vampires, liches, mummies. It seemed that overnight, whether it was the southern countries, the northern highlands, Arendelle, or even the eastern countries, a large number of undead creatures began to appear suddenly. The traces of liches began to become more and more frequent. These liches that were originally hidden in the corners of the material plane appeared one after another. Among them, there were liches and undead from other planes of negative energy. They sneaked into the material plane and caused countless disturbances. In the distant eastern countries, there were some very dangerous ancient mummies that ran out long before the appearance of the winter ghosts. This news was sent by the Eastern Princess. So far, the Eastern Princess still did not come to the city of Moder, but the dancer under her command sent a handwritten letter. It expressed humility and respect for Soren, and also described the recent difficulties faced by the eastern countries. The ancient evil creatures had just appeared not long ago, and they were not given a little time to breathe. In the remote desert of the eastern countries, a large number of mummies were awakened. These mummies appeared out of nowhere, and they gathered together under the control of the ancient mummies, constantly attacking and harassing the eastern countries. Many monasteries were now in a state of full preparation for war, and in the letter, the Eastern Princess also said that as soon as she finished dealing with things here, she would immediately set off to visit Soren in person. Regarding this matter, Soren's attitude was more tolerant because recently, the contracted girl, Cicada, who was given divinity by him, had also completed the training of a fist master. She was sent to the desert by the monastery to clean up these mummies that suddenly appeared. Maybe I should consider forming a group of monks. As a god, Soren needed to pay attention to a lot of things every day, but this would not affect his plan at all. He would soon be promoted to a great divine power. As a god with great divine power, there were many groups of monks in the churches of various gods. Soren's church was still relatively simple at present, and rogues accounted for too much of the population. He needed to inject more fresh blood and some talents with special abilities. The monks of the evil faction were one of the targets. Soren had been cultivating Cicada for some time. With a trace of divinity given by Soren, Cicada was now a legendary monk. What he was now considering was whether to take time to guide her and let the girl come forward to form a group of monks within the church for him. Monks were a very special profession. There were many talents in this profession, and because of the different paths they pursued, the relationship between monks and the secular world was relatively weak. This could make up for the shortcomings of Soren's church being too deeply involved with the secular world. In the middle of September 1677 of the New Moon era, Fallen which finally left the city of Moder and set off for the legendary Seal City. Soren could do nothing about all this because even if he was promoted to a great divine power, he could not easily enter the Seal City. However, on this day, a very strange thing happened in the city of Moder. It was probably in the morning. Suddenly, a very powerful energy fluctuation appeared in the city of Moder. This energy fluctuation covered the entire island of Moder, and then all the witches in the city of Moder felt that it was difficult to cast spells. Some witches whose profession level was too low suddenly lost all their ability to cast spells. Fortunately, this panic-inducing thing did not last long, and soon they regained the power to cast spells. Soren also noticed this at the first time. He almost instantly appeared in Gloria's laboratory, and then saw the elemental furnace in full operation, and Gloria, who was assisting in the experiment next to her. The preliminary test has been completed. Since obtaining the scepter of Savras, Gloria began to have a trace of divinity, less of a mortal's intimacy, and more of a divine spirit's detachment. She smiled at Soren, nodded and said, "Close the magic lock. Cancel the anti-magic enchantment." Thalling began to calculate the test results. That's right. The magic lock that had just shrouded the island of Moda was activated, and it was in a complete state, so it needed the elemental furnace to provide full energy. Soren was surprised and said, "The anti-magic enchantment was successful?" Gloria nodded gently and said, "At present, the preliminary test has been successful. When the magic lock is fully activated, the anti-magic enchantment can restrict the casting of all spells below the third circle. I also figured out some of the principles of the magic net after getting the information of the mage priesthood. But to complete the complete anti-magic enchantment, I'm afraid we still need to build a small magic net inside the magic lock." The anti-magic enchantment. One of the research directions of the city of Moder. After Soren seized the scepter of Savras, Gloria's research finally made a breakthrough. And according to this progress, the city of Moder may really be able to restrict the abilities of other spellcasters in the future. Only those who have the permission of the city of Moder can cast spells freely within the scope of the anti-magic enchantment. Chapter 984. Moder City, Laboratory. In the second laboratory connected to the shadow plane, Alice was assembling the parts in front of her with a serious face. Soren's figure was also not far away, quietly watching Alice. Today's experiment had a lot to do with him, because one of the items came from Soren. Assembly complete. On Alice's test bench, a huge boxing glove had been completed, and there were other parts next to it, but it was not assembled. She turned to Soren and bowed slightly, then put her palm into the boxing glove and said, "Start the test. Activate the mana power armor, arm. Start charging." The lavender crystal tube was injected with mana, and then Alice's huge fist with a diameter of about 30 centimeters shook, and a faint light appeared on it. Alice first tried to move her fingers, then turned her wrist joint and recorded, "Flexibility is average. Equivalent to an ordinary human. Start the test of strength." After that, Alice walked to a heavy iron block in front of her, grabbed it with one hand, and lifted it up, and recorded, "Test weight is 1,000 kilograms. Done. Very easy. Increase the weight test." Alice turned to the second heavy object. This test was done 3 times in a row, and the final weight was 1,500 kilograms. Not far away, Soren had been quietly watching all this. What Alice was holding was the arm part of the power armor that he had obtained. It was not until the alchemy technology tree in Moder City was high enough that he took it out for research. The upper limit of strength that an ordinary human could get was 18 points. According to the records of the interstellar era in his previous life, the record of the Olympic men's weightlifting champion was 275 kilograms. This kind of strength was already 1 in 10,000, and it was probably between 18 and 19 points if it was switched to the data template. The repaired arm of the mana power armor provided about 25 points of strength, and the result of the current test was that it could lift 1,500 kilograms with one hand. If he started the test with both hands, the data should be improved a lot, but the improvement should not be too big, because the ability of this kind of rune was constant. The flexibility test looks like it's only about 10 points of agility. Soren stared at Alice as she removed the power unit. He thought to himself, it seems that the power unit is the same as the golem. It has a clear shortcoming in terms of agility. At this moment, Alice had already walked over and said softly, "The test data is almost complete." If the entire set was equipped, the user's strength could be raised to the level of an iron golem. Even an ordinary person should be able to reach that level, but their resistances are too weak. Even if they're equipped with magic constructs, they won't be able to withstand the impact of battle. I think the Arcane Empire's runes should have an energy protection system. Soren nodded. That should be the case. The power of the magic construct should be above that of the iron golem. There's an alchemical construct life form in the Arcane Tower. Can you use it to repair your runes? After hearing this, Alice hesitated and said, "I can try. But there's no guarantee of success. The magic construct is more similar to a close-fitting armor enchantment. Some enchanted armor and gloves can also greatly increase the user's strength, but they're not as complete as the magic construct." Soren pondered for a moment and said, "I know. But the golem has a lot of limitations. Its intelligence level is far from being able to complete some tasks. The price of an advanced alchemical life form is too high, so the magic construct is a relatively cheap but flexible combat resource. Try to complete the assembly first, and then add an energy shield. After that, Soren teleported out of the laboratory. The attack on the divine kingdom of fear made Soren see one of the drawbacks of the golem army. It was that they were completely inflexible, and their reaction speed was too slow in actual combat. Unless there was a huge suppression of numbers, a more flexible troop class was needed to coordinate with the command. This made Soren think of the magic construct. Their users were determined to be ordinary soldiers. The cost was much more expensive than the steel golems, but not as good as the diamond golems. A complete magic construct could arm an ordinary soldier to the legendary level. For Soren, the number was not too much. Only a small team was enough to make up for the shortcomings of the golems. A few days passed in the blink of an eye. Just as Soren was busy replenishing his forces, some changes began to happen near the city of Mordor. Quagmire Swamp. This was another small island near the island of Mordor. Because of the large increase in population, Mordor quickly established a town here. Mordor had a large number of clay golems as labor force, and they had a natural advantage in building towns. In just half a month, a port town was built. Now there were about 3,000 people here. However, the town of Quagmire Swamp was a bit restless today. With the rapid sound of the alarm, the civilians who were working outside the town quickly returned to the town. This kind of alarm would only ring when there was a serious danger. With the panicked expression of the civilians, a team of 100 town guards quickly came to the wooden wall and looked nervously at the cemetery not far away. Priest Philo. The man who looked like a guard nervously said to the priest next to him, "What should we do now? Should we ask for help from Mordor?" The priest on the side looked very serious and whispered, "We have sent a message to the temple. But it will take some time for the temple guards to arrive. Your task is to guard this place during this time." More than 1,000 meters away, dark green flames appeared on the cemetery. These were spirit flames, a kind of ghost with a challenge rating of about 5. As if some kind of filthy power had affected this place, there was a sound of the soil under the cemetery, and then a rotten hand stretched out from the ground, and then a decayed undead climbed out of the coffin. There were hundreds of undead near the cemetery. Some of them were dead humans, and some of them were indigenous people who had been expelled and killed. 3 skeleton wolves that had been dead for a long time gathered together. Their eyes were burning with soul fire, full of resentment towards the living. It was almost evening now. Night was approaching, and the number of undead that came back to life increased. In the end, most of the undead that came out were skeletons, and there were already thousands of them. There were only about 100 guards in Quagmire Swamp Town. At this time, when they saw the undead army gathering, they were obviously nervous, and the number was still increasing. Damn it! Why are there so many undead here suddenly? The gathered undead began to attack the town. They seemed to be affected by some kind of evil power, and their movements were even more agile than when they were alive. There were even some skeleton archers. In just a short while, the guards of Quagmire Swamp Town had already died. What made them feel even more uneasy was that their dead comrades were resurrected in a very short time and became terrifying ghouls. No. Philo's expression was extremely ugly as he muttered, "The dead shouldn't be resurrected so quickly, and they shouldn't be turned into ghouls. Only an undead plague can cause something like this to happen." As if to confirm his words, not long after the attack on the town walls began, the town began to panic, and screams of agony began to fill the air. Philo was certain that not a single undead had managed to sneak into the town, so he seemed to have sensed something. His expression was ashen as he rushed down from the walls. As expected, he saw a corrupted ghoul. An old man in his 50s had already become a vicious monster. Philo hefted his heavy hammer and charged forward. If he allowed the ghouls to attack freely, the entire town would become a playground for the undead. The priests of this world were not weak spellcasters. Most of them used warhammers and warhammers, and they wore medium armor or heavy armor. Even though they were not as proficient in martial arts as warriors, they were still quite fierce in melee combat. Any priest was capable of both tanking and fighting. Die. Filthy undead. The ghouls did not last long under Philo's attacks, especially after the priest cast a divine spell. However, the situation was getting worse little by little because more and more ghouls were appearing. 1, 2, 3, the dead civilians were quickly resurrected and became ghouls again. What was even more disturbing was that some professions had turned into even more terrifying ghouls after they died. These evil creatures would automatically add the Ghoul Touch ability to their attacks. Normal warriors would not be able to resist them at all. Philo had already foreseen that the town would not last long, but he still gritted his teeth and held on because his only hope was that the Mordor city would quickly respond and send reinforcements. It was as if his prayers had been answered. In the darkness of the night, a few agile shadows quickly approached from the shoreline. They rushed into the undead army and killed more than 10 enemies in the blink of an eye. A young girl wearing silver-white armor appeared. Pharaoh knew who she was. She was Annalyn from Amber City, a powerful Holy Spirit priest. Annalyn's appearance had changed greatly compared to before. At this moment, she frowned and looked at the rapidly corrupted ghouls in front of her. She muttered, "Undead plague? There must be a lich or a high-grade undead nearby. Send people out to find the source of the plague." After that, she rushed forward with her heavy flail. This was a long-planned attack. The plague had already seeped into the bodies of the town's residents. After the undead attacked, a large number of civilians quickly died and turned into ghouls. The priests began to cast divine spells to purify and dispel the disease. However, the outbreak of the plague was too sudden. More than 70% of the civilians were already showing signs of turning into zombies. They could only save about 20% of them. Chapter 985. This is outrageous. An angry roar sounded in the study. Soren stared at the followers in front of him with a pale face, and then a murderous voice sounded, "They are looking for death. Send someone to investigate immediately. Find these liches even if you have to dig 3 feet into the ground." Damn it. What Soren didn't expect was that these liches dared to target him when the city of Mordor was at its peak. The undead plague that appeared in Mud Pool Town was obviously man-made, and it had been planned for a long time. The priests sent by the temple found traces of pollution on the food and water. It was obvious that someone had sneaked into Mud Pool Town to prepare for all this. The city of Mordor was protected by Soren's domain. Within the range of the magic lock, Soren's divine power covered the entire island of Mordor. The enemy obviously couldn't find an opportunity on the island of Mordor, so they targeted Mud Pool Town. Fortunately, the city of Mordor reacted in time. Otherwise, thousands of undead soldiers would have appeared in Mud Pool Town overnight. These damned bastards dared to lay their hands on innocent civilians. According to the news from the temple, nearly 2,000 civilians in Mud Pool Town had been turned into ghouls. Only a few hundred people had survived. This gave Soren a great sense of crisis. Because Mud Pool Town was right next to Mordor, there were enemies who could sneak in and spread the plague. If it was in other places, the consequences would be even more serious. Priests. I need more priests. Soren frowned and looked in the direction of the temple. Although he had hundreds of thousands of followers, the number of priests was only about 200 or 300. These priests were scattered in the sphere of influence of Mordor. On average, there were only 2 or 3 priests in a town. 1 priest and 2 trainee priests. To fight against this evil power, the priests must be aware in advance. Soren realized that he should expand the number of priests and improve the range of divine spells. He was about to become a great divine power, but the number of his priests was still maintained at the standard of a mid-level divine power. This was mainly because of the Avatar crisis. Soren's divine power was accumulating at a very fast rate. He was accumulating 20 to 30 divine power points every day. Now that he had fewer enemies to face, he should focus on reducing his divine power points and increasing the number of priests under his command. Divine power was inversely proportional to the number of priests. The more priests there were, the more divine spells they could bestow upon Soren. The fewer priests there were, the more divine power Soren would be able to accumulate. However, if there weren't enough priests, he wouldn't be able to expand and maintain the faith of his believers. What Soren needed to do now was to reduce the accumulation of divine power and temporarily increase the number of priests. Men. Soren pondered for a moment and waved his hand. Order the temple to recruit a group of priests. Some priests from the Church of Shadows can also be accepted. In the near future, increase the number of priests in the church to more than 500. Under normal circumstances, a village of hundreds of people could only afford a trainee priest, and a town of thousands of people could afford a formal priest. This was the most efficient way to harvest. It could not only maintain the divine spells of the priests, but also allow Soren to continuously accumulate the power of faith. But now he had to increase the number of priests because those who were infected with the zombie poison and the plague needed the help of priests. Soren had to double the number of priests to ensure that there were at least 3 formal priests in each town. At the same time, Soren thought about it and sent a letter to the Church of Agriculture. It wrote about the recent attacks on the city of Moder and asked them to send people to the Wind Spear Hills. Now, more than 150,000 refugees had gathered in the Wind Spear Hills. These refugees had just settled down, and their living conditions were still very simple. If a lich suddenly spread the undead plague among them at this time, there would be an army of more than 100,000 undead overnight. Are these guys ready to do it? Soren, who had calmed down, couldn't help but fall into deep thought. It was obvious that the undead disaster was breaking out. Just relying on the dead people was not enough for the undead lords to launch a conspiracy, so they began to spread the plague in the material plane, which could greatly increase the number of deaths and then rapidly expand the scale of the undead. At present, the population of the material plane had decreased by about 20%. Because of Soren, the number of deaths had decreased by tens of millions. In particular, the prosperity of the southern and southern seas had attracted many refugees. According to the normal progress, many cities should have been destroyed like Amber City. A city of tens of thousands of people would end up with only a few thousand people left. In this case, if the liches launched an attack, they could turn a city into a paradise with more than 100,000 undead almost overnight. However, because of Soren's influence, many places were still intact, especially the northern witches and Arendelle. Under normal historical progress, the fall of the goddess of magic would cause a large number of witches to die, and these dead witches would quickly be transformed into undead wizards in this wave of impact. In the original history, these dead witches had caused the fall of the northern lands in a single night. But now the rise of Soren saved most of the witches. Although the number of resurrected undead was still large, it did not form a terrible sea of undead. So these guys brought forward the time of the plague? Soren frowned and put down the document in his hand. The 4th wave of impact was the largest casualty during the Avatar crisis. Because the purpose of the undead lords was to kill the living, this wave of impact caused more than 30% of the population to die. Although Soren had great power, he could only protect the city of Moder at present. As for other places on the road, it depended on the reaction of many gods, churches, and secular forces. My lord. A black shadow appeared outside the study and said in a deep voice, "There is a large-scale fever epidemic in the Amazon rainforest. It has caused thousands of deaths." As soon as his voice fell, another black shadow appeared outside the study and hurriedly said, "My lord. Signs of the plague have been found near Shipwreck Bay. The presiding priest of the temple has cleaned up the infected. But because the situation is serious, the port and roads are temporarily blocked." Tap, tap, tap. A tall witch with a beautiful face also appeared outside Gloria's laboratory at this time. She said with a serious expression, "Your Excellency Gloria. The Eye of the North sent news that there is a large-scale plague near the northern tower. They found the trace of a demigod lich and fought with it. The intelligence network of Motor City responded very quickly. Almost soon after the attack on Mudpool Town, news from all over the place was sent to Soren. Fever epidemic, plague, undead plague, this was indeed the work of the undead lords. Soren frowned and immediately ordered, send people to block the port immediately. From today on, all people who enter and leave must be strictly checked. Inform Port Tylon and Raging Sand Island to temporarily suspend overseas trade. All important trade will be carried out by airships. Soren was not afraid of these plagues, but as a god, there were times when he could not do anything. That was, if the plague spread on a large scale, even if he could save thousands of people, it would be impossible to save hundreds of thousands of infected people. These damn undead were obviously going all out. After the plague, it would be the awakening of the natural disaster. At that time, the awakened undead would reach a very terrifying scale. Come. Soren took out a command and said, immediately stop accepting refugees in the Windspear Hills. Some of those refugees must have been infected with the plague. Order the whole Windspear Hills to be blocked, and the 7th Fleet to Shipwreck Bay. One could imagine. The millions of refugees wandering around the south coast were probably going to suffer. But at this time, Soren could no longer ignore them. If he continued to accept these refugees, he was afraid that everything accumulated in the Windspear Hills would collapse in an instant. The living environment of refugees was the worst and most chaotic. And they were also the easiest place for the undead lords to attack. It could be imagined that almost all the cities that accepted refugees recently had some infected people. It only took 2 or 3 days. News from all over the world was constantly sent to Mordor. The first news to reach Mordor was from the Amazon rainforest. A terrible fever broke out in their territory. Even the strong Amazonian warriors could not be immune. In just a few days, the number of people who died in the Amazon rainforest because of the epidemic reached tens of thousands. Not even the Church of the Lord of Storms could do anything about it. That was because the priests of the Lord of Storms weren't good at healing, and all of the Lord of Storms priesthoods were destruction and combat. With the outbreak of the plague, the priests could do nothing but watch it spread. Finally, it was the Storm Lord who issued a cruel order. He sent the Storm Lord of the Temple to directly destroy the most infected town with more than 30,000 people. The army of the Temple directly flattened the town and killed all the infected people. At this time, Soren suddenly began to miss his enemy. Yes. Soren suddenly missed the goddess of plague and disease. If she was still alive, with her clergy and divine power, she should be able to resolve this crisis. But she had died in the hands of Soren, and it was impossible for her to be resurrected. That's right. As if thinking of something, Soren looked up and murmured, Corinne. She has the divine power of the goddess of plague. Fallen Witch. In the battle to kill the goddess of plague, Fallen Witch merged with part of the power of the clergy of plague. Maybe she had a way to resolve this crisis, but at this moment, she was still in the Sigil City, and no one knew when she would return. Chapter 986. The city of Mordor fell into a state of alert. Anyone with unknown origins was strictly interrogated, and all ships and merchants entering and leaving the port were strictly restricted. Basically, under the orders of Soren, the city of Mordor gave up almost 70% of its trade. Soren was now basically planning to interrupt most of the trade to resist the last 2 waves of the Avatar crisis. And now Mordor had such strength under his accumulation. The wealth from Treasure Island made up for the consumption of Mordor's money. The minerals from the bottomless abyss made up for the consumption of Mordor's materials. At the same time, he also had some supplies from the Githyankis and the Fomites. There was no problem in maintaining the consumption of Mordor for a year or 2. At present, the only food supply that limited the population of Mordor was now self-sufficient. Therefore, Soren decided to implement a management plan of a comprehensive blockade of Mordor. Now Mordor was basically in a state of seclusion. While constantly receiving the population of the south coast, it also gave up trading with other forces. The signs of the undead disaster had become more and more serious. Several lurking necromancers had been found in the Inquisition of Mordor. What made Soren obviously uneasy was that the wizards' organization specializing in necromancy seemed to have been recruited by the undead kings. What was even worse was that Soren's church actually found a very small number of very special wizards from it. It was the Inquisition of the Shadow Church who found them, but because the other party was a wizard, Gloria also sent a witch to check it out. After seeing it, the witch was shocked and immediately told the news to Gloria. Then Gloria went to see it in person and was also surprised to send the news to Soren. At this moment, Soren had come to the Inquisition at the back of the temple. Then he saw a few very conspicuous big bald heads, as well as rune tattoos on their necks, backs of their heads, chests, and other parts. Red Robe Wizards. They were a group of people who were very easy to recognize because these people liked to wear red robes, all shaved heads, and had very obvious tattoos on their bodies. The organization of the Red Robe Wizards had existed in the material plane for thousands of years. They were one of the representatives of the evil wizards. They had once disappeared from the material plane, but no one expected them to appear in Mordor City at this moment. The Red Robe Sorcerers Association was a very evil sorcerer organization. Because of this, they were once brutally suppressed by the Arcane Empire. After that, the Red Robe Sorcerers disappeared in the Arcane Calamity. Even now, no trace of them could be found. Where did they come from? Soren frowned as he looked at the red-robed wizards in front of him. Their bald heads were a little dazzling, so he asked the drow rogue who was in charge of the interrogation. There were only a few drows in Mordor, and most of them were in charge of special tasks. The one in front of him was an expert in torture in the Underdark. He knelt down on one knee and said to Soren, "My lord." They said that they came from the lower planes, a large half-plane between the shadow plane and the spiritual realm, very close to the grey wilderness where the undead live. Other planes? As expected. The Red Robe Sorcerers Association did not disappear, but some of them escaped to other planes. Soren glanced at the big bald heads in front of him and reached out to pick up the face of one of the female wizards. Inside the Red Robe Sorcerers Association, both men and women would shave their heads bald in the later stages, so that they could engrave runes on them. Soren's eyes shone with the brilliance of divinity, and he directly used his magic to seize the other party's consciousness. Most of the time, women's will was weaker than men's, and they were easier to control. "Tell me." Soren's figure seemed to have a trace of magical power, full of endless temptation. He said in a deep voice, "When did you return to the material plane? How many of you are there? How big is your demi-plane? How many members are there in the Red Robe Sorcerers Association?" The expression of the red-robed witch became blank, and she seemed to have a trace of dementia. After hearing Soren's words, she replied honestly, "We returned to the material plane half a month ago. We sent more than 30 people in this operation. Our plane is about the size of a southern kingdom. The Red Robe Sorcerers Association currently has more than 300 official wizards. A centipede dies but never falls down. Tori's Red Robe Sorcerers Association was once a great enemy of the material plane's peace. Their organization's origin was special because the Red Robe Sorcerers were separated from their homeland by a group of Mulhorandi sorcerers. They created a country ruled by sorcerers instead of god kings. This was Mulhorandi's way of rule. Mulhorandi's divine system was similar to the Egyptian divine system. These sorcerers eventually formed the government structure of Tori, and they fought against their neighbors intermittently for several centuries. However, due to the disputes between the various factions of the organization, their plans were often disrupted. The origin of the Red Robe Sorcerers came from the gods of another world, and this divine system seemed to be gradually dying out like the other divine systems in the desert. Note, similar to the crocodile god and the goddess of wealth and death in the desert. The existence of the gods was not completely eternal. Especially when the gods of another world invaded other worlds, it was very likely that they would be attacked by the native gods, and it could lead to the other divine systems joining forces. The number of seats in the Pantheon Temple represented the number of gods, and many of the empty seats were the ones that fell in the struggle between the divine systems. Huh. Soren seemed to have noticed something. He reached out and looked at the tattoo near the chest of the witch in front of him and said, "You're all necromancers." The witch in front of him was already mentally controlled by Soren, and she said in a dull voice, "Yes." The Red Robe Sorcerers Association's strongest faction is the Necromancers, and 80% of the sorcerers are necromancers. The other factions have long been divided and died out in the past. As expected. No wonder the Red Robe Sorcerers were mixed up with the Undead Lords. There were some very famous and powerful liches in the Red Robe Sorcerers Association. It was obvious. The other factions in the Red Robe Sorcerers Association were almost wiped out in the past, and the only one that survived was the Necromancers. This faction had the most liches, and they had all kinds of ways to escape death. Soren was silent. After a while, he said in a deep voice, "Who sent you?" The witch said in a dull voice, "The Undying, Oro. He promised us that after the plan was successful, he would give us a kingdom in the material plane, and restore the Red Robe Sorcerers Association's rule over the kingdom." The Undying, Oro. Soren's expression changed after hearing this, and his expression became very serious. This was a very powerful lich, and it could even be said that he was one of the strongest liches to date. He was also the mastermind behind the undead calamity, and the most terrifying undead lord. This was a lich that had existed since the Nesser era. He was also one of the sorcerers with the highest level. Oro used to live in the endless caverns under the Supreme Forest, and his goal was to hunt the noble races. He had already made a name for himself during the Nesser era, and began to study the mysteries of death. At that time, Oro was still an immortal mortal. But during the Year of the Broken Magic Net, another Nesser sorcerer, Karthus, tried to seize the power of the goddess of magic, which led to the collapse of the magic net and directly destroyed the Nesser era. The entire Nesser Empire lost its source of magic, and the ancient Nesser sorcerers died one after another. Oro's undead legion was directly destroyed, and the collapse of the magic net triggered a spell on his body. He didn't die because of it, but he was transformed into a terrifying lich. That's right. This was an ancient lich that had existed since the first goddess of magic. Oro, Undying, Demigod Lich, Level 15 Mage, Level 5 Great Mage, Level 10 Legend, Level 5 Nesser Arcanist. These were Oro's stats on the surface. He had a special legendary class that was still unknown to the outside world. As for his strength, it was even more impossible to know because over the long years, he had gathered countless undead army under his command, and there were also many liches working for him. This ancient Nesser remnant had always been trying to restore the empire. There were very few records about him, and it could only be confirmed that this terrifying lich had become one of the undead lords, and had always been hiding in the lower planes near the underworld. "Are you all ready to move out?" Soren frowned and waved his hand. "Leave this witch, and get rid of the others." After saying that, Soren turned and left the temple. He looked up at the dark night sky, and his sight seemed to cross the plain. He murmured, "The first undead lord has appeared. Then, the queen of the Githyankis and the Death-Eye tyrant should also appear soon, right?" The undead calamity wasn't just an attack planned by human liches. There were also traces of other undead behind this. It wasn't just the undead transformed by humans, but also the undead transformed by other races. Moreover, one of the masterminds was the Queen of the Githyankis, a terrifying existence with a challenge rating of 28 and above. Lich Queen, Valakis. The real queen who had ruled the Githyankis for thousands of years, and she was also the queen who had been in power for the longest time. This terrifying monster ruled the Githyankis with high pressure, and she absorbed the essence of the Githyankis who were level 11 and above. Then, in the middle of the Arcane Empire, she was defeated in the war between the Githyankis and the Great Arcanists. But the Lich Queen didn't really die. She had been hiding in a corner of the multiverse, waiting for the opportunity to regain everything. Note, this was a plane war that broke out in the middle of the Arcane Empire. In order to develop the resources of the astral world, the 7 floating cities of the Arcane Empire were teleported to the astral world and launched a war against the Lich Queen who ruled the Githyankis. Soren moved forward in silence. The accumulated power of the undead was very terrifying, and it wasn't much weaker than demons and devils. Without the suppression of the clergy of death, it was difficult to predict the later stage of the undead calamity. After all, there were no more 3 million paladins supporting the world. Chapter 987. The Wilderness. This place was close to the southern countries, and it was also a gathering place for refugees. Because there was relief from the Tower City nearby, many refugees stayed here. However, at this moment, this area had become hell on earth. Tens of thousands of corpses were exposed in the wilderness. After the outbreak of the plague, many towns and cities set up fortresses near the road checkpoints to prevent large numbers of refugees from approaching. Those cities that had been ravaged by the plague had a large number of people fleeing, which led to the emergence of more refugees. At present, the southern countries had sealed their borders, and many cities had entered a state of alert to prevent outsiders from entering. However, the spread of the plague was not only limited to the floating population. A large number of corpses led to the emergence of a terrible disease, and the plague was one of the most terrible of them. Although there was no Black Death in this world, similar diseases still existed. If the gods were still gods, they would definitely not let this plague spread. However, now that the gods had fallen into the mortal world and become saints, their means of organizing the plague had weakened a lot. The priests could not stop the spread of the plague at all. In a large town, there were only a dozen or so priests in total. Even if they used all their divine spells in a day, they wouldn't be able to save many people. Compared to the millions of people infected with the plague in the material plane, the power of the priests was negligible, and the gods did not have enough divine power to support the priests. As the plague spread, an even worse situation appeared. Humans were the race with the most population in the material plane, and as the plague spread, especially when famines still existed, many human corpses became food for other species. The first to be infected were the goblins. Goblins were active in the wilderness, and they were like cockroaches that could not be killed. Every year, a large number of them would be born, and these creatures could survive as long as there was grass. The infection of the goblins sped up the spread of the plague. The gnolls and ogres, who used the goblins as food, were also quickly affected by the plague. Then the plague in the south began to spread in all directions, and soon the elves on the periphery began to be infected. The second race that was seriously affected was the orcs. With the war in the western wilderness, the plague spread to the orcs. The barbaric civilization was not enough for the orcs to resist the spread of the plague on such a large scale. Soon, the shaman priests could not stop the spread of the plague. The first to die were large numbers of livestock. The strong beast men had strong resistance, so they did not fall quickly under the plague. However, after the orcs, who were half farmers and half livestock, were infected by the plague, tens of thousands of livestock died in a single night. In the short span of half a month, the survival of the orcs had been brutally challenged. Because the cattle and sheep that had died from the plague could no longer be eaten, the beastmen's food reserves could not support the consumption of the entire tribe. What was even more serious was that due to the large number of livestock deaths, the orcs would not be able to recover in the next few years. This meant that they would have to plunder from other races in order to satisfy the consumption of their race. The spread of the plague showed no signs of slowing down, and the halflings in the Siar region soon became the targets of the plague. Even with the protection of the halfling gods, this fertile land was not immune. In just a few days, thousands of halflings were infected and died. The northern witches had sealed off the entire region. They were monitoring the many towns and rivers, searching for the source of the plague. The only place in the entire material plane that was less affected was Arendelle. Perhaps because of the cold climate of the Frost Kingdom, the scale of the outbreak of the plague in Arendelle was the smallest, and the casualties were even less than in the territory of Mordor. But something worse happened. The plague began to spread in Sauron's army. When the navy of Raging Sand Island was infected, the power of the plague spread so quickly that Sauron had to isolate these people and put them on Snake Island. The gods finally could not sit still. Both the gods of the good and evil factions temporarily stopped fighting and began to search for the source of the plague. The battle between the surface elves and the drows also temporarily stopped because the plague had spread to the Underdark, and the Queen of Spiders, Lolth, had to start dealing with these terrible plague. Sauron also made a change. He penetrated his divine power into the disease and poison domains. The power of these two domains came from the plundering of the goddess of disease. Soren gave the divine spell of a cure the plague as the core, which greatly strengthened the priest's ability to treat diseases. At the same time, the city of Mordor began to increase the number of doctors and treat these infected people with medicine. The population on the road began to decrease rapidly, and more towns became desolate, even faster than the previous war. With the large decrease in population, the power of death also became stronger. Even Soren's divine power began to show obvious improvement because he was also in charge of the power of slaughter. The aura of death made the undead begin to increase gradually, and the number of ghouls was somewhat out of control. At the same time, with the surge of ghouls, a demon lord of the abyss also became more and more powerful. His followers began to appear in the material plane and expanded at an amazing speed. These dark followers were the Church of Ghouls. They could not give others too much power and wealth, but they had a special ability. As long as they joined their church, they would not be injured by ghouls. This change also began to affect the abyss. On the third floor of the bottomless abyss, the attack plan of Yeenagu, the king of gnolls, was unexpectedly affected. Because the king of ghouls, whose strength had skyrocketed, seemed to have the help of some external forces and was gradually breaking free from the control of the king of gnolls. It seemed that the undead kings were trying to win over this terrible abyss demon. The Gnoll King's backyard was on fire, and he had to temporarily give up the expansion of the abyss and try to regain control of the King of Ghouls. And on this day, a terrible evil force returned to the abyss. Orcus had returned. The undead king of the abyss. The demon lord who was in charge of the undead. One of the three giants of the abyss. The terrible Orcus had returned. Orcus was one of the three giants of the abyss. He fell into a deep sleep during the Arcane Empire. His deep sleep was an important reason for the rise of the Queen of Succubus. Because the older generation of demons gradually fell into silence, the Queen of Succubus rose rapidly. The King of Ghouls was his most important servant and the commander of his huge undead army. He once waged a war with Six-Fingered that involved many layers of the abyss, but was eventually forced to stop because of the rise of the Arcane Empire. At this time, on the 421st floor of the abyss, the territory of the King of Ghouls, the White Kingdom. Countless nether transformation ghouls were gathered together, and at the center of this kingdom was an enormous hall made of bones. The King of Ghouls, Dorison, commanded all the ghouls. Unlike other ghouls, his body was straight, not hunched like his kind all day long. His eyes shone with pale green light. He wore a luxurious robe and leather armor, wore a white bone crown, and held a spine-shaped staff called the Hungry Tooth Staff. There was a skull on the top of the staff to show respect to Orcus. In the past, for a very long time, there were a large number of gnolls in this kingdom. They were responsible for supervising the ghouls and driving them to work and fight. Now all the gnolls had become food for the ghouls driven by endless hunger. This place was out of the control of the king of gnolls, Yeenagu. A black bone portal appeared. With a terrible pressure, all the ghouls could not help but kneel on the ground. This time, the aura from the king of undead spread with the evil and filthy power, and a terrible demon appeared. This demon-like creature was fat, about 3 times the height of an ordinary person. Huge, spiral goat horns grew out of his goat head. His legs were covered in thick brown hair, and his hooves resembled those of a goat. Its huge and strong arms brandished an evil skull wand. 2 huge black bat-like wings extended from his back, and a long snake-like tail with a sharp barbed hook trailed behind him. He was Orcus, one of the most powerful demons in the abyss. He was also the king of all the undead in the abyss. Orcus had a huge undead army, and the enemies he killed would directly transform into soldiers and generals in his army. Great Undead King. The King of Ghouls welcomed the arrival of the Abyss King. He humbly lowered his head and said, "Your servant has been waiting for your return." A mighty army of undead appeared. Ghouls, skeleton soldiers, corpse demons, bound spirits, shadows, corpse witches, hags, liches, mummies, Boda corpses. Orcus's enormous undead army appeared behind the teleportation gate. They had already gathered in a magnificent hall made of bones. Obviously, his resurrection and awakening were related to the other undead kings in the underworld, and this undead disaster seemed to have been planned for a long time. Roar! The awakened Orcus seemed to be a little crazy. His pupils were full of chaos and killing intent, and his mind was not as clear as other demon lords. He was more like a demon controlled by the chaotic power of the abyss. He let out a terrible roar towards the sky. Along with this furious bellow, a force spread across the entire multiverse in an instant. The next moment. Material plane, Motor City. Soren, who was far away in the sea, instantly appeared on the high platform of the arcane tower. He looked at the dark night sky and murmured, "Orcus is resurrected." The former king of the abyss was announcing his arrival. Not only Soren, who was far away in the sea, but all the gods in the material plane and even the senior demons of the Bator Inferno were also aware of the resurrection of a powerful demon. Chapter 988. Orcus had returned. This terrifying demon lord was a legend in itself. Orcus was once a mortal, and no one knew the details of his life as a mortal. They only knew that at that time, he was already a fat man who was proficient in some spells. After his death, his soul came to the outer plane and became the lowest level of larva. He began his struggle in the abyss and eventually became one of the most powerful demons in the abyss. The abyss was a magical place. It was full of absolute chaos, but absolute chaos was full of possibilities. There could be order and many incredible existences. In this way, Orcus became a powerful demon lord, evolving from a small abyssal worm. But his experience was not only that. After his rise, he met a terrible enemy, the drow demigod, Clavansari. That was how Orcus' first death began. But that did not mean the end. After more than 1,000 years, Orcus returned. He was resurrected, but lost most of his power. But Orcus finally rose again, and he also mastered the power of the last word. He died again in the process of looking for the staff of Orcus, but then he was resurrected by his servant. This was a very special demon lord, because the number of times he died and resurrected was far more than other existences. It seemed that he was a creature that was difficult to eliminate from the root. Looking at the gods, devils, and demons, it was extremely rare to be resurrected after more than 1,000 years, and Orcus was one of the special cases. So when he announced his return to the multiverse, the gods were not too surprised, but they felt a headache. The undead kings were expanding their power. At the same time, these powerful undead kings were showing their trump cards to the gods, telling them that they were qualified to fight with the gods. The undead, Owo. The Lich Queen of the Githyanki. The undead king, Orcus. At present, Soren knew that there were already 3 undead kings who had the ability to fight with the gods. He did not know how many more terrifying existences were hidden among them. Eastern Desert. In this lifeless desert of death, a strange portal appeared. Then some liches wearing strange red robes came out, followed by some wizards who were still alive. The most obvious sign of them was a big bald head, and there were strange tattoos on their bodies. And in charge of these people were some terrible undead wearing rusty red robes. They had Naruto's emblem on their bodies, and the leader was a half-undead priest. Naruto was an absolute supporter of those who did evil for their own pleasure. In Naruto's cold world, everything was the same. For him, all living creatures were a great insult to him, the god of death. On the contrary, all the dying creatures were shining with green and black sparks of joy. He liked these sparks. Some people did not pray to Naruto devoutly, hoping to get the power of Naruto. Most of them were given death as a reward by Naruto. Naruto's church kept a large number of undead in captivity. As a god in charge of death, Naruto was a very terrible enemy. He could cast the hand of death 17 times a day. During the Avatar crisis, Naruto was one of the most difficult gods to kill. And as a powerful god of death, even during the Avatar crisis, Naruto could perceive any death in the material plane within a week. If he was in the form of a god, he could perceive any death in 17 weeks. In other words, the information this god of death had was very terrifying. Almost all the undead that greeted these wizards were legendary. They were scattered on the left and right sides of the portal. As the red-robed wizards in front of them separated, a presence full of evil appeared. It was a lich. Sazastin. The former ruler of Tori, the most powerful and the most terrible existence among the red-robed wizards. A terrible lich with a challenge rating of 31 and above. He looked like a skinny, pale-skinned human wearing a luxurious robe. He had dark eyes, a thin black beard, and withered hands. Of course, he could change his appearance with magic. Usually, he liked to transform into a tall scholar, old but energetic, with a pair of shining black eyes and a hoarse voice that sounded like it was squeezed out from his throat. At this time, Sazastin's appearance was transformed. He did not look like a lich, but more like an excessively old wizard. He bowed slightly to the priest in front of him and said in a hoarse voice, "Nice to meet you. Naruto's messenger." The half-undead priest nodded slightly and said in the same lifeless voice, "The operation is about to begin. We have found the trace of Clemvox. Now, what we have to do is to gather all the forces to kill him." Sazastin nodded gently. As one of the famous liches in the multiverse, he knew very well that if they did not kill Clemvox, their plan would be difficult to succeed. Death god Jurgil had retired from the stage of history. After secretly observing for a long time during the Avatar crisis, the undead kings finally found that death god Jurgil had no intention to intervene in the battle of the gods. And this also meant an important opportunity. In the case of Jurgil's inaction, they could seize more things. Naruto was one of the masterminds. But among the kings of the undead creatures, there were also many existences who were spying on more powerful forces. Darkness shrouded the material plane. The undead creatures seemed to have overshadowed the devil's brilliance. The devils active in the material plane gradually withdrew their breath. They seemed to have sensed that something was wrong and were unwilling to fight the undead creatures head-on at this time. This retreat meant that the souls were plundered by the undead. The resurrected souls began to appear near a large number of graveyards, and the death of millions of creatures directly led to the emergence of a large number of ghouls. The first wave of the disaster of the undead had not broken out yet. But Soren knew that all this was not far away, and the key to determining the intensity of the disaster of the undead was on one person. That was Clemvox. King of the dead, Clemvox. The main god of the death divine system, and the most powerful god of death at present. No one knew where Clemvox was, because Clemvox had not shown any trace since the outbreak of the Avatar crisis. He was very cautious. Soren was looking for Clemvox, and the other gods were also looking for him. Because of the current situation in the material plane, only Clemvox's divine power could appease these undead and let the resurrected undead creatures rest in peace. The city of Mordor was operating at high speed. After the War of the Kingdom of God, Soren began to crazily plunder the resources of the Abyss, and at the same time, mass production of golem puppets. Now, many places below the city of Mordor had been hollowed out. Golem factories were built, and then a large number of manpower was invested in the production of war machines. The outbreak of the disaster of the undead was a war of attrition. Because even the demons did not have the endless cannon fodder of the undead. If they could not kill the undead king who drove them, then many undead would be resurrected again and again. Time passed in silence. Everyone foresaw the terrible disaster coming, but the gods in the form of saints could not stop it because their power was weakened too much. What the gods could do now was to protect their believers and churches as much as possible, and give the wilderness to the wandering undead. At the same time, in the Underdark, the powerful Queen of Spiders also encountered trouble. Because a very terrible creature of the Beholder appeared. Death-Eye Tyrant. This kind of undead creature transformed from the Beholder began to appear in large numbers in the Underdark. It seemed that the undead kings were also plotting something here. The city of Mordor. Soren spent more and more time watching the stars at night because he found that the glory of the gods was getting dimmer and dimmer. So far, there was no action in the city of Mordor, and Soren was also restraining himself and waiting for something. Of course, he was not waiting for the appearance of Klemvox, but for the arrival of another god. The arrival of a god from another world. In the boundless multiverse, the gods were not limited to the material plane where he was now. There were other gods in other worlds, and only the Pantheon was the place where they could meet. However, during the disaster of the undead, there was still a god from another world, and Soren was now waiting for her arrival. Under the dim night sky. A meteor suddenly appeared in the sky, and Soren's figure stood up instantly and murmured, "She's finally here." The goddess of magic and death, Verges. Mid-level divine power, another god from the death god system. The goddess who was in charge of both magic and death came from another material world and once had some relationship with the second generation of the goddess of magic. The meteor streaked across the sky. Soon it disappeared from sight. No one knew where the god went, but Soren already knew of her arrival. There were many gods from another world in the multiverse. Even the gods of the material plane had invaded other worlds. The orc god system was one of the outsiders who had taken root here. At the same time, there were also the ancient Mohun god system and the gods from other worlds in the Pantheon who had visited here. The arrival of the goddess was a sign. Because shortly after her arrival, the disaster of the undead officially broke out. Soren silently looked at the dark night sky, as if something important was attracting him. After a long time, he murmured, "Is it finally going to start? I hope the power of the god of light can stop all this." This catastrophe was not something he could stop with his own strength. The god of light, who was close to the greater divine power, was the protagonist of the next two shocks. Only he could destroy the conspiracy of many undead kings. Chapter 989. The power of the undead became stronger and stronger. In the distant glorious city, near the Wind Valley city, the Church of the God of Light also broke out in a war. After days of tracking, the paladins finally found the evil winter ghost, but the enemy had already resurrected a large number of undead. After paying a heavy price, they finally defeated the undead, but when they killed the winter ghost, they paid a heavy price. Even with the divine power of the God of Light, in order to kill this terrible enemy, one of the most powerful paladins in the Church of Light, the Hand of Silver, who had once met Soren, died. A legendary paladin with a profession level of more than 27 sacrificed his life in order to destroy the terrible winter ghost, which was a heavy blow to the Church of the God of Light. The winter ghost was dead. But all this was not worth celebrating, because soon after killing this winter ghost, there were traces of being killed by the withering fire near the wizard city. This meant that there was more than one winter ghost that entered the material plane. Someone had awakened them and sent these terrible creatures to the material plane. It was already mid-September. The outbreak of the undead disaster made the city of Mordor welcome some special visitors. In the temple, Soren's figure appeared on the throne. He nodded slightly to the three ladies in front of him and said softly, "Welcome. Lady with fiery hair." The beautiful woman standing in front of Soren had long red hair that was breathtaking. Her beauty was difficult to describe in words. She was the kind of beauty that was between the gods and the mortal women. She was the goddess of love and beauty, Shuni, and also the goddess of love in the material plane. Soren had contact with this goddess before, but those were not formal contacts. This time, the other party's visit was obviously more formal because standing next to her were the important gods, the goddess of joy and the goddess of cat and dance. Soren had a brief contact with these three, and their arrival was obviously not just for sightseeing. "Nice to meet you, Lord Shadow." Although Soren belonged to the lawful evil faction and the goddess of love belonged to the chaotic good faction, Shuni's attitude towards Soren was still very friendly. This was not only because Soren had helped the goddess of joy and the goddess of cat and dance, but more importantly, because Soren had killed an enemy that she hated very much. That was the goddess of pestilence and poison, Talona. Shuni's priesthood was beauty, love, and passion. This goddess placed beauty in front of love because beauty was the key to triggering love. The goddess of poison was her enemy and the target of her hatred. Shu and I believed that the goddess of poison's existence was the reason why many beauties in the world were destroyed. Therefore, after Soren killed the goddess of poison, even though the two of them were on opposite sides and weren't on good terms with each other, her favorability towards Shu and I was still raised to friendly and above. Soren walked down from the throne with a smile, took Shu Ni's white hand, and then led her to sit side by side with him. In any case, Shu and was a great god. Although her combat power was at the bottom of the great gods, she was more or less one of the main gods. It was just that the scale of her divine system was a little small. The goddess of love looked at Soren with a smile. Her eyes were a little flirtatious and full of a kind of subtle teasing. This goddess was a romantic figure among the gods. She was passionate and unrestrained, but also temperamental. She was a typical figure of the chaotic faction. She had a history of love with many gods, and in the mortal world, she was also the god with the most romantic anecdotes. Soren smiled slightly, sat down side by side with Shu and said softly, "I don't know why the fire-haired lady came to Mordor." The fire-haired lady was another name for Shu and I. After talking about business, the goddess of love's expression suddenly became serious. She looked at Soren and said seriously, "The situation on the mainland is not very safe recently. I hope that some of my believers can come to Mordor for temporary refuge. Of course. I will also pay you a satisfactory reward." After that, the goddess of love raised her beautiful eyebrows, and her expression seemed to be a little flirtatious. As the most talked about god at present, the goddess of love naturally also inquired about Soren's background and knew a little about his temper, so it was not strange for him to talk directly to her. She had an important purpose for this trip. If the situation was not so bad, she did not want to ask other gods for help. Shelter? Soren was slightly stunned when he heard this, and then he understood the reason for the matter. The key to this was the goddess of love herself. Although she was a great divine power, because of her priesthood, she was also one of the weakest among the great divine powers. Although the powerful divinity and divine personality could give her great divine power, her clergy had nothing to do with fighting, which led to her not being able to exert that kind of power. The most important thing was that the Church of the Goddess of Love was very strange. With Soren's understanding of the Church of the Goddess of Love, it was easy to understand the key to the Goddess of Love's request. Just how weird was her church? Although it could be understood with a few examples. First of all, many of the Goddess of Love's followers were hedonists, and the other gods thought that most of Shuni's followers were seen as frivolous and superficial people who loved vanity, but were not dangerous. Her church would hold a grand carnival every month, and most of the wealth was spent on pleasure. Moreover, because of her clergy, although the Church of the Goddess of Love was spread all over the world, the number of followers was extremely unbalanced. The number of female followers far exceeded the number of male followers. When there were fewer female followers, there would be more than a quarter, and when there were more female followers, there would be more than twice the number of male followers. Moreover, because of the clergy, the internal fighting power of the Church of the Goddess of Love was very low. A group of hedonists did not have much fighting power, and most of the devout followers were weak. The number of people in the church who could fight could be counted on one hand. Because of the clergy of beauty, the Church of the Goddess of Love especially liked to collect art. Shuni's priests were all aesthetes and hedonists, and they worked hard to find happiness and beauty in all things. The pursuit of art and enjoyment was their life. The clergy of Shuni's church would buy all the beautiful paintings, sculptures, and handicrafts they found in order to fund the excellent artists. They were even willing to buy these works of art at a higher price than the market price, hoping to increase the production of beautiful handicrafts. They would keep repeating this behavior until the church could not afford it. In order to maintain their beauty, her priests spent a large amount of money on the pursuit of beautiful art and self-care. So even though her church was quite rich, it was easy to spend the budget. That's right. The Church of the Goddess of Love was so strange. Shuni's clergy was beauty, love, and passion, and her domain was chaos, charm, kindness, and protection. Her only fighting ability was charm, so Shuni's church basically inherited the characteristics of the goddess of love. In other words, there were a lot of good-looking people in her church, but except for charming the enemy, almost none of them could fight. Soren's church casually sent a high-level rogue out, and he could defeat several professionals of the same level in the church of the goddess of love. The whole church was a typical appearance association. There were countless beautiful women, and there were also a lot of handsome men. The worst was that they did not look good, but their charm was not bad. But the fighting power of these people could basically be expressed with a ha-ha. They were good-looking but useless. The whole church of the goddess of love, including her divine system, was in such a situation. Whether it was Shuni herself, the goddess of joy, or the goddess of cat and dance, none of them could fight, and there were almost no believers in the church who could fight. That was why Shuni had been secretly helping the Lady of Silvermoon against the Lady of Night. Her own strength determined the status of the gods. The goddess of love had a wide range of believers. Her arrival today was obviously because the situation on the mainland had caused her church to be unable to protect the believers, and in order not to let the believers lose a large number of lives, she finally chose to extend an olive branch to Soren. The city of Mordor was a very safe place, relative to the entire material plane. Soren fell into deep thought. After a long time, he said slowly, "That's not impossible. But if Mordor wants to accept these people, I also have some special requirements." Shuni immediately said, "What requirements?" Soren pondered for a moment and said, "I can only accept about 50,000 people, and they can only temporarily live in the territory of Mordor. In Mordor, they must follow my rules, and they will be directly governed by the laws of Mordor. Then, I need a temporary alliance agreement. We can talk about the specific content later." The goddess of love agreed without hesitation, "Okay." 50,000 people were enough for her to transfer the devout believers near the south coast to Mordor. As long as they survived the Avatar crisis, these people could go back. "Well." Soren nodded and said, "Then I'll talk about the alliance agreement in detail. And I also need some help from the Fire Lady." Although the believers of the goddess of love were some hedonists, these people also had a certain value to Soren. Because these people were all rich people. It was impossible for people without money to enjoy themselves. Although the goddess of love did not have the priesthood of wealth, the believers she attracted were all people who pursued beauty and hedonism. These people were almost all quite valuable. If these people came to Mordor, they would naturally have to spend money. Clothing, food, shelter, and transportation. Soren could not provide these for free. These people who liked to enjoy themselves would spend a lot of money in Mordor. While the goddess of love was visiting Soren, some other gods also began to secretly contact him. The arrival of the undead disaster finally made another powerful god a little restless. Since the god of light took over the priesthood of justice, there were not many powerful gods in the human god system who could fight. The arrival of the undead disaster made one of the most powerful gods finally stand up, and the powerful church that served him was also officially involved in the secular struggle. He was the god of war, Tampa's. He was the most powerful one among the powerful gods, and his combat power was second only to the god of light in the human god system. As the Avatar crisis reached the end, the gods who could fight and those who could not began to polarize. P.S. I've been a little bit speechless recently. Don't worry, I'm writing slowly because I want to write a good ending. Chapter 990. This was Sigil City. It was the most special place in the multiverse. Here, you could see angels and demons drinking together. Demons would also raise their glasses politely to each other. This place included most of the races in the multiverse. Sigil City was connected to almost every place in the multiverse. Therefore, any creature could enter Sigil City. Some came here on purpose, while others came by accident. Tuolumne came here by accident. He was an evil spirit from the lower planes. Because of the damned space, he came to Sigil City by accident. It had been more than 600 years since then. Over the past 600 years, Tuolumne had become very powerful. His demonic bloodline allowed him to live much longer than a mortal. Tuolumne was running his own forces in Sigil City. He had opened an inconspicuous tavern in the south of Sigil City. It was called Taste of Flame Tongue. This tavern was responsible for serving demons, and evil spirits in Sigil City. Some strong liquors were delicious for demons, but poison for other races. To survive in Sigil City, one had to follow the rules here. Otherwise, the Lady of Pain would not even need to do anything. The gods and the ascendants would teach them a lesson. Tuolumne had always followed the rules of Sigil City. As an evil spirit, he used the rules here to make a living. Now, there were more outsiders in Sigil City. As the Lady of Pain opened up Sigil City's authority, traces of other creatures began to appear in the portals that had been closed for a long time. Some came here on purpose, while others came by accident. Astral wanderers were one of the most common visitors in Sigil City. In the past, many powerful beings who explored the astral world would temporarily stay in Sigil City. As long as they followed the rules of Sigil City, no one would make things difficult for them. Recently, there were many more demons and angels in Sigil City. It seemed that some portals had been opened. Creatures from the upper and lower planes appeared here. The number of humans was relatively low. However, Tuolumne saw a human today. A very special human. The moment he saw her, Tuolumne's heart was filled with greed. This was because he felt a trace of evil demonic aura from her. He knew where this aura came from. He had seen Sister Radiance before. He felt a similar aura from her. This human woman in front of him had the mark of the succubus queen. She was an exceptionally charming human female. She looked very suitable to be a succubus. It was obvious that this was her first time in the Sigil City, because no one who had been in the Sigil City would enter her tavern. Trom's tavern was only responsible for serving the evil creatures of the lower planes. Many of the drinks here were deadly poisons for humans. Only a newbie would make such a mistake and enter his tavern. The human woman in front of him was clearly stunned when she walked into the tavern. Her arrival attracted the gazes of many ferocious-looking creatures. Most of them were demons and evil spirits. Devils were not frequent customers of Trom's tavern. "Welcome to my tavern. Ma-am." Turum noticed the greedy gazes of some of the demons, so he greeted them warmly. "What do you want?" he asked. "I have a lot of drinks suitable for humans." At this point, he glared coldly at the devil beside him. He was the owner of this tavern, and secretly controlled some powerful fighters, such as a Hezru who was close to becoming a high-grade Hezru. "Just give me a normal glass of wine." The human woman in front of him looked calm. She seemed to be a witch, which made Turum hesitate for a moment. He secretly considered if he should attack the human in front of him. The Sigil City had its own rules. That is, as long as any conflict is not discovered and not brought to the table, then it is allowed. There were countless corpses in the trenches of the Sigil City, but there had never been an open war here, because the Lady of Pain had never allowed it. The Lady of Pain had never taken the initiative to manage the Sigil City. There were many organizations here that maintained order in the Sigil City, because if the Lady of Pain were to attack, the result would be terrible. As long as the battle was carried out cautiously, it could be tolerated. If it went out of control, the Lady of Pain would have a special punishment for the idiots who caught her attention. All creatures in the Sigil City, whether they were angels or demons, whether they were believers of the gods or emissaries from another world, were forced to follow the Lady of Pain's rules. No one could go against it. Because those who went against it had already paid the price, and most of them had disappeared forever. This was obviously not a place where humans should stay. The human witch in front of him calmly drank a glass of wine, then hurriedly left. The moment the witch left, Turum saw a special staff. The greed in his eyes finally made him decide. He secretly called for someone behind him, then went out of the side door. There were many dark alleys in the Sigil City. These alleys were used to settle disputes. Because the Sigil City did not allow open war, no battle would easily break out on the streets. Every inch of the alleys here was stained with blood. Kill her. Although he considered the possibility that she was a believer of the Queen of Succubus, Turam was not afraid. This was the Sigil City, a place where even the Queen of Succubus could not interfere. The Queen of Succubus had always wanted to regain control of the Sigil Cities fallen out of favor. However, because this was the Sigil City, she could not do anything. A human with the sigil of the Queen of Succubus, and an invaluable staff. As a legendary demon, Turam felt that this was a very, very good prey. A newbie who had just entered the Sigil City. After the witch had been in the Sigil City for a while, it would be difficult for him to succeed so easily. Anyone who came to the Sigil City would quickly familiarize themselves with the rules here. Because those who could not familiarize themselves with the rules were all dead. The Hezru attacked very quickly, and as a cunning demon, Turam quietly approached and prepared to launch a sneak attack. He believed that in the narrow space of the alleys, his chances of success were very high, and the witch would not have time to cast a spell. But suddenly, he found that the witch in front of him revealed a strange smile, and then he couldn't move. Everything seemed to have stopped. Time stop. Legendary spell, despair shrouded Turam's heart. At this time, he realized that he had provoked a terrifying existence. But he had no chance to regret because what he saw was his last scene. P.S. I recommend Reagan's new book, Beacon Emperor. An old author, you can read it if you like. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Love Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.